Chapter 1. The Abandoned Project. The golden light of Terra's dying sun filtered through crystalline panels, casting long shadows across the vast laboratory complex that burrowed deep beneath the Himalayan mountains. Here, in chambers that had never known natural illumination, the Emperor of mankind stood before his greatest work and his most terrible mistake. 20 gestation pods lined the sterile walls of the primary laboratory, each one a marvel of biotechnology that surpassed even the gene forges of Mars. Within their amniotic embrace, genetic templates of unimaginable complexity had been taking shape for solar decades. The Emperor's own divine essence, distilled and refined through techniques that no mortal mind could comprehend, had been crafted into 20 distinct patterns. Each pod contained not merely flesh and bone, but the potential for godhood itself. Yet something was wrong. The Emperor's enhanced senses, honed across millennia of existence, detected the subtle wrongness that pervaded the chamber like a creeping plague. It was not visible to the naked eye, nor could the most sophisticated Auspex arrays detect its presence. But it was there, coiling around the gestation pods like invisible serpents, whispering promises of corruption into the developing minds within. "The warp storms grow stronger each day," Malcador the Sigillite observed, his ancient voice barely disturbing the chamber's oppressive silence. The Regent of Terra stood at the Emperor's side, his psychic presence a calming anchor in the rising tide of chaos that pressed against reality's boundaries. "Our astropaths report increasing difficulty maintaining communication with the outer worlds." The Emperor did not respond immediately. His consciousness expanded beyond the confines of flesh, stretching out through dimensions that mortals could not perceive. There, in the roiling madness of the imperium, he sensed them. The dark gods of chaos, their attention focused like burning brands upon his laboratory. They had found his project. Worse, they had been influencing it. "How long?" the Emperor asked, though he already knew the answer. "The corruption began approximately 6 months ago," Malcador replied, consulting a data slate whose runes flickered with defensive wards. "Subtle at first, minor fluctuations in the genetic matrices that could be attributed to natural variants. But the patterns are unmistakable now. The ruinous powers seek to claim your sons before they are even born." The Emperor's jaw tightened imperceptibly. 20 years of work, 20 years of planning, of careful genetic manipulation, of crafting beings who would serve as his generals in the coming Great Crusade. Each pod contained a Primarch, a superhuman leader designed to command the armies of humanity in their reconquest of the galaxy. They were to be his sons in both flesh and spirit, inheriting his wisdom while surpassing even the vaunted custodian guard in their martial prowess. But now they were tainted. The Emperor approached the nearest pod, where a half-formed figure floated in synthetic amniotic fluid. Even in its incomplete state, the developing Primarch showed signs of the superhuman physique it would possess: muscles that would never know fatigue, bones that could withstand bolter-fire, a brain capable of processing information at superhuman speeds. Yet beneath the surface, the Emperor's psychic sight perceived the tendrils of corruption worming their way through the genetic code itself. "Can the corruption be cleansed?" he asked, though he already knew the answer to that question as well. "Not without fundamentally altering what they are meant to become," Malcador said sadly. "The chaos influence has intertwined itself with their base genetic structure. To remove it would require starting again from the beginning, and by then the Great Crusade will have already begun." The Emperor was silent for a long moment, his golden eyes reflecting the soft bioluminescence of the gestation pods. Around him, Servo skulls and automated systems continued their endless monitoring routines, unaware that they were witnessing the end of an age before it had even begun. "There are alternatives," Malcador continued carefully. "The Thunder Warriors have proven themselves capable of pacifying terror. With certain enhancements, they could serve as the primary force for galactic conquest. The Custodian Guard could be expanded." "The Thunder Warriors are flawed," the Emperor interrupted. "Their genetic instability makes them unsuitable for extended campaigns, and the Custodians, for all their perfection, cannot be mass-produced. We would need centuries to create sufficient numbers for a galactic conquest." "Then perhaps," Malcador suggested, with the careful tone of one who had counseled the Emperor for millennia, "the Great Crusade should wait." The Emperor turned to face his oldest friend and advisor. Between them passed a moment of perfect understanding, the weight of destiny balanced against the price of ambition. Through the laboratory's walls, the Emperor could sense the growing unrest of humanity's scattered worlds. Alien predators circled the isolated human colonies like vultures. With each passing year, more worlds fell to Xenos domination, or were lost entirely to warp storms. Humanity's window of opportunity was closing, yet to proceed with corrupted Primarchs would be to hand chaos the very weapons meant to defeat it. The decision, when it came, was swift and absolute. The Emperor raised his hand, and psychic fire erupted from his fingertips. Not the consuming flames of destruction, but the pure radiance of unmaking, energy that separated molecular bonds and returned complex matter to its component elements. The nearest gestation pod dissolved into its constituent atoms, its developing occupant never knowing that it had almost become a god. One by one, the Emperor moved through the laboratory, each gesture erasing decades of work and limitless potential. The servo skulls recorded everything, their machine spirits too simple to understand the magnitude of what they witnessed. 20 pods, 20 futures, 20 suns, all reduced to drifting motes of light that dissipated into the recycled air of the chamber. When the last pod was gone, the Emperor stood in the center of the empty laboratory, his golden armor reflecting nothing but bare walls and vacant mounting points. "The project files," he said simply. Malcador nodded and activated a psychic pulse that wiped every data core in the facility. Genetic templates that had taken decades to perfect, theoretical frameworks that pushed the boundaries of what was possible, backup samples that could have been used to restart the project. All of it vanished in an instant of mental fire. "And the research stuff?" "Memory modification," the Emperor replied. "They will remember working on enhancements to the Thunder Warrior project, nothing more. The knowledge of what might have been dies here." As they walked from the laboratory for the last time, Malcador asked the question that would echo through the millennia to come. "Do you regret this decision?" The Emperor paused at the threshold, looking back at the empty chamber where gods had almost been born. "Regret is a luxury I cannot afford," he said finally. "But I wonder, will humanity be strong enough for what is coming without them?" Behind them, automated systems began the process of sterilizing the laboratory, preparing it for new purposes. The age of the Primarchs was over before it had begun. Now the Emperor would have to find another way to unite the galaxy, and another way to protect humanity from the dark gods who sought its destruction. The Great Crusade would still come, but it would be fought by mortal men and women, enhanced by science, but not blessed by divinity. Whether that would be enough remained to be seen. As the massive blast doors sealed the laboratory forever, the Emperor allowed himself one moment of doubt. In destroying his sons to save them from corruption, had he doomed humanity instead? Only time would tell. Chapter 2. Thunder and lightning. 6 months had passed since the Emperor's fateful decision in the gene laboratories beneath the Himalayas, and the vast training grounds of the Imperial Palace echoed with sounds that Terra had never heard before. The thunder of 10,000 superhuman warriors, moving in perfect synchronization, shook the ancient foundations, while overhead, golden-armored figures moved through aerial combat drills that defied the laws of physics. The Emperor stood upon the observation deck of the Palatine Tower, his golden eyes surveying the transformation of his forces with satisfaction that was carefully tempered by pragmatic concern. Where once 20 regiments of Thunder Warriors had been deemed sufficient to conquer Terra, now 100 regiments drilled in the courtyards below. The recruitment had been massive, drawing candidates from every corner of the homeworld, the strongest, most psychically resilient specimens humanity could offer. The genetic enhancement protocols show remarkable improvement, reported Chief Janitor Arkan Land, consulting a data slate whose runes flickered with complex biodata. Integration of the refined techniques from the previous project has increased survivability rates by 37%. The new Thunder Warriors show greater stability, enhanced cognitive function, and most importantly, extended operational lifespan. The Emperor nodded, though his attention was focused on a particular section of the training grounds, where a different kind of warrior moved with inhuman grace. These figures were larger than the Thunder Warriors, their movements more controlled, their golden armor gleaming like captured starlight. At their head stood a figure whose presence commanded respect, even from the superhuman soldiers around him. Constantin Valdor, Captain General of the Legio Custodes, had undergone his own transformation in recent months. Where once the custodian guard had numbered in the hundreds, carefully crafted individuals created through processes that took years to complete, now Valdor commanded thousands. The Emperor's decision to expand the custodes had required innovations in their creation process, techniques that maintained their individual perfection while allowing for greater numbers. The custodian expansion proceeds ahead of schedule, Valdor reported, ascending to the observation deck with steps that made no sound despite his massive frame. The new recruitment protocols you devised have proven highly effective. Each candidate undergoes 18 months of enhancement, rather than the previous 5 years, yet their capabilities remain exceptional. The Emperor turned to regard his greatest creation among mortal warriors. Valdor stood nearly as tall as the Thunder Warriors, but where they were crude instruments of war, the Captain General embodied martial perfection, refined to its absolute pinnacle. His psychic presence radiated unwavering loyalty and tactical brilliance that made him the equal of any general who had ever lived. "And the Lightning Warriors?" the Emperor inquired. Valdor's expression remained impassive, but the slight pause before he answered spoke volumes. "The trials continue, my lord. Of the first 100 candidates, 17 have survived the enhancement process. Those who emerged, they are formidable, but the instabilities remain problematic." In a restricted section of the training grounds, sealed behind both physical barriers and psychic wards, the Emperor's most ambitious experiment was taking shape. The Lightning Warriors represented an attempt to create something between the raw power of the Thunder Warriors and the refined perfection of the Custodes. Using genetic techniques salvaged from the Primarch project, the Emperor had sought to craft soldiers who could be produced in significant numbers while retaining superhuman capabilities. The results had been mixed. "Show me," the Emperor commanded. They descended through the labyrinthine passages of the Imperial Palace, past chambers where Thunder Warrior recruits underwent genetic therapy that would either transform them into living weapons or kill them outright. The mortality rate remained high, nearly 40%, but those who survived emerged as beings who could shatter ceramite with their bare hands and process battlefield information faster than any mortal mind. The Lightning Warrior testing ground was a marvel of imperial engineering, a vast arena where gravitational fields could be manipulated and atmospheric conditions altered to simulate any battlefield environment in the galaxy. Within this controlled chaos, 17 figures moved through combat scenarios that would have been lethal to any baseline human. They were magnificent and terrible to behold. Taller than Thunder Warriors, more heavily muscled than custodians, their physiques showed the clear influence of genetic templates that had been meant for gods. Yet there was something unstable about them, a barely contained energy that crackled at the edges of their movements, as if their enhanced bodies struggled to contain the power within. Lightning Warrior designation, Prometheus, Valdor announced, as one of the enhanced warriors approached. Survival time in combat simulation, 14 hours continuous. Physical capabilities exceed baseline Thunder Warrior parameters by approximately 40%. Cognitive enhancement significant, but... He paused. Psychological profiles indicate potential instabilities. The Lightning Warrior designated Prometheus stood before his emperor with an expression that mixed reverence with something that might have been hunger. His armor was a hybrid design, heavier than standard Thunder Warrior plate, but incorporating aesthetic elements from custodian craftsmanship. Most unsettling were his eyes, which held an intelligence that seemed almost too bright, too intense. "My emperor," Prometheus spoke, his voice carrying harmonics that resonated in ways that normal human vocal cords could never achieve. "We live to serve. The galaxy awaits your thunder." There was something in the way he spoke that gave the emperor pause. The Lightning Warriors had been designed to be loyal, but their enhanced cognitive abilities had produced something unexpected, a kind of passionate devotion that bordered on religious fervor. They didn't simply follow orders. They seemed to worship the very concept of conquest in the Emperor's name. "Dismissed," the Emperor commanded, and Prometheus withdrew with movements that were just slightly too fluid for natural human motion. "The psychological profiles concern me," Valdor admitted, once they were alone. "The Lightning Warriors display enhanced aggression and what the genitals describe as conquest fixation. They are eager for war to a degree that may prove problematic during peacetime operations." The Emperor considered this as they walked through the vast armories where weapons were being produced for the expanding armies. Bolt weapons by the thousands, power armor in sizes to fit Thunder Warrior physiques, and more exotic weapons drawn from the dark age of technology's archives. The scale of preparation was staggering. Enough equipment to outfit armies that could conquer star systems. "Perhaps that is not entirely a disadvantage," the Emperor mused. "The coming crusade will require warriors who hunger for victory. The question is whether we can direct that hunger toward appropriate targets." Their tour concluded in the deepest levels of the palace, where the Emperor's personal training chambers had been expanded into a complex that rivaled the gene laboratories in scope. Here, the master of mankind personally oversaw the final stages of enhancement for his most promising candidates. Thunder Warriors who showed exceptional potential were brought here for additional modifications, while custodian candidates underwent trials that tested not just their physical capabilities, but their souls. "The expansion proceeds, but it comes at a cost," the Emperor acknowledged as they stood before a massive tactical display showing the disposition of Imperial forces across Terra and the Sol system. "Quality versus quantity, a balance we must maintain carefully. Too few elite warriors, and we lack the numbers for galactic conquest. Too many enhanced soldiers, and we risk the kind of instabilities that destroyed previous civilizations." Valdor studied the display, where glowing icons represented the growing strength of the Imperial armies. The Thunder Warriors number 100,000 combat-ready troops with additional cohorts in training. The Custodian Guard approaches 10,000 active members. The Lightning Warriors, he hesitated, 17 functional units, with another 200 in various stages of development. It will have to suffice, the Emperor declared. Reports from our long-range scouts indicate increasing Xenos activity in the outer systems. Several human worlds have gone dark entirely. The window for galactic reunification grows smaller with each passing year. As if summoned by his words, a servo skull descended from the chamber's vaulted ceiling, bearing urgent dispatches marked with the seal of the Imperial Navigator houses. The Emperor accepted the data slate with hands that had shaped the very foundations of human civilization. Mars requests an audience, he read. The Mechanicum has completed their analysis of the STC fragments we provided. They believe they can mass-produce power armor, suitable for Thunder Warrior physiology within 6 months. Valdor raised an eyebrow, an unusual display of emotion for the Captain General. And the price of their cooperation? Recognition as the sole source of technology for the coming crusade, and exclusive rights to any archaeotech we discover during the campaign. The Emperor's expression was unreadable. Acceptable terms given the circumstances. Around them, the sounds of the expanding Imperial war machine continued. The ring of metal on metal, the hum of genetic enhancement equipment, the thunder of superhuman warriors learning the arts of galactic conquest. The Emperor had chosen a different path than the one that would have led to godlike Primarchs commanding his armies. Instead, he would rely on the enhanced mortals he could create in great numbers, warriors whose loyalty was earned through shared struggle rather than genetic programming. Whether this choice would prove wise remained to be seen. But as the Emperor looked upon his growing armies, Thunder Warriors who could shatter mountains, Custodians who embodied martial perfection, and Lightning Warriors who burned with the desire for conquest, he allowed himself a moment of optimism. The Great Crusade would begin soon, and when it did, the galaxy would learn what human determination could accomplish when backed by science, strategy, and the iron will of the master of mankind. In the depths of the palace, machinery hummed with the constant work of transformation. Every day brought new warriors into being, each one a weapon forged in the crucible of the Emperor's ambition. The Age of the Thunder had begun. Chapter 3. The Slow Crusade begins. The first ship to bear the Aquila, beyond the orbit of Pluto, was the Bucephalus, a massive battle barge whose hull had been reinforced with technology that married the finest Imperial engineering with gifts from the Mechanicum of Mars. From its command deck, Admiral Hastur Sejanus watched as the greatest armada in human history spread out across the void like a golden constellation of war. 2 years had passed since the Emperor's decision to abandon the Primarch project, and the fruits of that choice now filled the darkness between stars. Hundreds of vessels, from swift destroyers to massive troop transports, carried the instruments of galactic reunification into the unknown. Within their holds, 100,000 Thunder Warriors waited in stasis, while 10,000 custodians maintained their vigilant watch over the expedition's most precious cargo, the Emperor himself. "All fleet elements report ready, Lord Admiral," announced Captain Ezekiel Abaddon of the 63rd Imperial Expeditionary Fleet. The young officer had risen quickly through the ranks, his tactical acumen earning him a place among the expedition's senior command despite his relatively modest origins. Thunder Warrior Legions 1 through 20 are at full deployment readiness. Custodian Guard companies have assumed protective formations around the flagship. Sejanus nodded, though his attention was focused on the tactical displays that showed their first target, a star system designated 63-19, where long-range augury had detected signs of human habitation. According to the navigators, the system had been cut off from Terra for over 5,000 years, lost during the worst of the Age of Strife. What they would find there was anyone's guess. "Signal the fleet," Sejanus commanded. "Initiate warp translation on my mark." The Great Crusade was beginning, not with the superhuman Primarchs that had been planned, but with mortal commanders leading enhanced soldiers into the unknown. It was a fundamental change that would reshape everything about humanity's reconquest of the stars. Within the flagship's strategium, a circle of men and women who would have been footnotes in another timeline now bore the responsibility of galactic conquest. The Council of War, as they had come to be known, represented the finest military minds that baseline humanity could produce, each one enhanced through careful genetic therapy and psychoconditioning to operate at the peak of human capability. General Corith Kane commanded the Thunder Warrior Legions, his strategic mind honed through decades of warfare on Terra's most brutal battlefields. Admiral Sejanus controlled the fleet elements, his understanding of void warfare unmatched among mortal commanders. Magos Reductor Inarkek represented the Mechanicum's interests, his augmetic implants allowing him to interface directly with the expedition's war machines. And overseeing them all, the master of mankind himself had taken direct command of the expedition in a way that had never been intended. The Emperor, who should have been guiding his superhuman sons from afar, now stood at the center of every strategic decision, his immortal intellect compensating for the lack of Primarch-level leadership. "Warp translation complete," announced the navigator, her voice strained from the effort of guiding such a massive fleet through the Imperium. "We have arrived at the edge of System 63-19. Augury scans, detecting significant technological activity on the third planet." The main tactical display shifted to show their destination, a world that bore the scars of old violence, but also the signs of recovery. Orbital stations hung in space like metal flowers, while the planet's surface showed the geometric patterns of vast cities. Most importantly, the Vox channels crackled with transmissions in recognizable High Gothic, though the dialect was archaic and heavily accented. "Human population confirmed," reported Magos Inarkek, his Vox grill crackling with electronic harmonics. "Population approximately 12 billion. Technological base appears consistent with late M25 standards. No immediate signs of Xenos contamination or chaos corruption." It was exactly the kind of world the Emperor had hoped to find, a human civilization that had survived the Age of Strife and was ready to rejoin the greater community of mankind. The first test of his modified strategy for galactic conquest was about to begin. The imperial compliance of Tegaton, as the world called itself, should have been a straightforward operation. The planet's government, a council of techno-monarchs, was initially suspicious but ultimately welcomed the prospect of rejoining a greater human empire. Their military forces, while primitive by imperial standards, were disciplined and well organized. Most importantly, there were no Xenos influences to complicate the matter. Yet what should have taken weeks stretched into months. Without Primarchs to serve as the Emperor's direct representatives, every negotiation required the Emperor's personal involvement or lengthy communications with Terra. Thunder Warrior commanders, for all their tactical brilliance, lacked the diplomatic skills and superhuman charisma that would have made integration seamless. The custodians were too precious to risk in anything but the most critical situations, and their very presence intimidated the local populations rather than inspiring them. "The compliance proceeds but slowly," General Kane reported during a strategy session 6 months after their arrival at Tegaton. "The local techno-priests have agreed to swear allegiance to the Imperium, but they insist on maintaining their traditional governance structures. Without higher authority, to enforce immediate integration, we must proceed through conventional diplomatic channels. The Emperor listened to these reports with the patience of someone who had witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations, but those who knew him well could detect the undercurrent of frustration. The Great Crusade was supposed to be moving at breakneck speed, consuming star systems at a rate that would reunite the galaxy within a few short centuries. Instead, they were spending precious months on single worlds, dealing with complications that superhuman leadership should have been able to resolve in days. "There is another concern," Admiral Sejanus added, consulting a data slate marked with the highest classification seals. "Our long-range scouts have begun reporting anomalies on several worlds ahead of our projected route." The Strategium's atmosphere grew tense as Sejanus activated a holographic display showing intelligence reports from deep space reconnaissance missions. The images were grainy, captured from extreme distances by automated probe ships, but they told a disturbing story. On the world of Chthoniya, mining operations were being led by a figure described by local legends as a sky-born king who had united the planet's warring gangs through a combination of superhuman combat prowess and tactical genius that defied explanation. On distant Caliban, reports spoke of a warrior knight who could cleave through the planet's monstrous great beasts with ease that seemed almost supernatural. Most unsettling of all, the civilized world of Macraga had recently been unified under the rule of a young statesman whose administrative capabilities were reportedly beyond anything baseline humanity should be able to achieve. "Skyborn demigods," whispered Malcador, who had remained silent throughout most of the briefing. The ancient sigillite's eyes were distant, as if seeing patterns that were invisible to the others. The scattered suns find their own destinies. The Emperor's golden eyes fixed on the holographic reports with an intensity that made the air itself seem to thicken with psychic pressure. For a long moment, the only sounds in the Strategium were the distant humming of the ship's systems and the barely audible whisper of recycled air through the ventilation grills. "Continue the mission," the Emperor said, finally. "But expand our reconnaissance operations. I want detailed intelligence on every world that shows signs of unusual leadership." As the meeting dispersed, each commander returning to their duties with new questions weighing on their minds, the Emperor remained before the tactical display. The images of distant worlds seemed to mock him, evidence that his sons had survived the destruction of their pods, had found their own paths to power, and were shaping the galaxy in ways he could not control or predict. The irony was not lost on him. In seeking to prevent chaos from corrupting his children, he had scattered them across the galaxy in a different way. Now they were growing to maturity without his guidance, developing their own philosophies and loyalties that might not align with his vision for humanity's future. The Great Crusade continued its slow advance through the outer reaches of the galaxy, each compliance a careful operation that required the full attention of mortal commanders and the personal involvement of the master of mankind. Behind them, newly integrated worlds began the process of transformation into imperial compliance, their populations learning to serve a distant emperor they would never see. Ahead of them, scattered across thousands of light years, the lost Primarchs continued their own conquests, unaware that their father was searching for them among the stars. Some were building empires of their own. Others were locked in struggles against Xenos predators, or the remnants of human civilizations gone mad during the Age of Strife. All of them were growing powerful in ways that the Emperor had never intended, shaped by experiences and environments that he could not have planned. The question that haunted the master of mankind as he stood in the darkness of the Strategium was simple. When they finally met again, Would his sons still be willing to call him father? The Great Crusade had begun, but it was already becoming something very different from what had been planned. In the depths of space, human fleets moved slowly but steadily toward a destiny that no one could predict. And on distant worlds, godlike beings who had once been destined to serve as generals were learning to rule as kings. Chapter 4. The Council Ascendant. The strategium aboard the Bucephalus had been transformed into something resembling the war councils of ancient Terra, where mortal generals had once planned campaigns that shaped the course of history. Around a vast hololithic table that displayed the current state of the Great Crusade, 12 figures in elaborately crafted armor bore the weight of galactic conquest upon their enhanced shoulders. 3 years had passed since the first ships had ventured beyond the light of Sol, and the lessons learned had been written in both victory and blood. 47 worlds now flew the imperial Aquila, their populations integrated into the growing empire through combinations of diplomacy, economic incentive, and, when necessary, overwhelming military force. Yet for every success, the expedition commanders had identified dozens of inefficiencies that would have been unthinkable under the original Crusade plan. The Aureus campaign has failed, General Tarek Togaden announced without preamble, his scarred face bearing the marks of the evacuation he had personally overseen. Total imperial casualties: 12,000 Thunder Warriors, 400 custodians, and 8 expedition vessels lost to Xenos torpedo attacks. The megarachnid proved more adaptable than our intelligence indicated. A collective silence fell over the High Command Council, the weight of the first major defeat settling upon them like a shroud. The Emperor, seated at the head of the table in armor that seemed to absorb and reflect the hololithic light, studied the tactical displays with an expression that revealed nothing of his thoughts. The High Command Council had emerged from necessity rather than design. As the Great Crusade had expanded beyond the capacity of any single commander to manage, even one with the Emperor's superhuman intellect, a structure had been required to delegate authority while maintaining strategic coherence. The 12 members represented the finest military minds baseline humanity could produce, each enhanced through genetic therapy and psycho-conditioning to operate at the peak of human capability. General Garviel Loken commanded the Thunder Warrior Reserve Legions, his tactical genius having proven invaluable during the compliance of the Proxima Centauri system. Admiral Marcus Septimus controlled fleet operations across 3 sectors, his understanding of void warfare making him the equal of any naval commander in human history. Forge General Kelbor Hall represented the Mechanicum's growing influence within the expedition, his augmetic enhancements allowing him to interface directly with the Crusade's increasingly complex logistics networks. But it was General Hasta Sejanus who had emerged as the Council's most prominent member, a man whose strategic brilliance and natural charisma had marked him as a potential War Master candidate. Unlike his previous role as fleet commander, Sejanus now bore responsibility for coordinating operations across multiple expedition fleets, his enhanced cognitive capabilities allowing him to process battlefield information from dozens of simultaneous campaigns. The megarachnid adaptation patterns suggest a hive mind intelligence, reported Magos Biologis Fabius, consulting data streams that flowed directly into his augmetic cortex. Their ability to counter Thunder Warrior assault patterns mid-battle indicates cognitive capabilities far beyond standard arachnid species. Recommendation: avoid direct assault tactics against hive mind Xenos without superhuman command presence. The Emperor's golden eyes shifted to the tactical display, showing the Aureus system, where the burned hulks of Imperial vessels drifted among asteroid fields that had been transformed into weapons by alien intelligence. The campaign had been planned as a standard compliance operation, Thunder warriors would establish orbital superiority, while custodian guards secured key objectives planet-side. Instead, they had encountered a Xenos species capable of tactical adaptation in real time, turning imperial advantages into liabilities within hours of first contact. The fundamental issue remains leadership capability, Constantin Voldor observed, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. Thunder warriors excel in direct combat, but lack the strategic flexibility required for complex operations against adaptive opponents. Enhanced mortal commanders provide tactical intelligence, but cannot match superhuman reaction speeds in rapidly changing battlefield conditions. It was a problem that had become increasingly apparent as the Great Crusade encountered more sophisticated opposition. The scattered human worlds had been relatively straightforward to integrate, but the galaxy contained threats that required capabilities beyond what enhanced mortals could provide. Xenos empires with technology that matched or exceeded imperial standards. Ancient artificial intelligences that could process battlefield data faster than any organic mind. Chaos cults whose psychic capabilities turned normal tactical doctrine into liability. "There are solutions," the Emperor said quietly, his voice carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate in dimensions beyond the merely physical. Reports from deep reconnaissance continue to identify individuals of exceptional capability across multiple sectors. The hololithic display shifted, showing intelligence reports that had been classified at the highest levels. Images captured by long-range augury showed figures whose capabilities defied explanation through conventional enhancement techniques. On the death world of Barbarus, a warrior had united the planet's scattered tribes and was reportedly leading campaigns against Xenos raiders that had plagued the system for millennia. On the night world of Caliban, a figure known only as the Lion had apparently eliminated the last of the great beasts that had terrorized the planet since the Age of Strife. Most intriguing of all was the world of Ultramar, where a young statesman named Robut Gilliman had not only unified his home world, but was reportedly building an interstellar empire that rivaled the Imperium itself in scope and efficiency. "Skyborn demigods," whispered Malcador, echoing his previous assessment. "They grow in power with each passing year, shaped by experiences we cannot control or predict." General Sejanus leaned forward, studying the intelligence reports with the intensity of a master tactician identifying potential assets. "Lord Emperor, with respect, these individuals represent exactly the kind of superhuman leadership our campaigns have been lacking. If they could be approached, persuaded to join our cause—" "The risk of such contact cannot be understated," interrupted Valdor. "We have no way of determining their loyalties, their psychological stability, or their resistance to chaos corruption. The very capabilities that make them valuable also make them potentially catastrophic if they prove hostile." The Emperor was silent for a long moment, his consciousness extending beyond the physical confines of the strategium to touch the distant currents of the warp. There, among the churning energies of the Imperium, he could sense the scattered psychic signatures of his lost sons. Some bright with purpose and determination, others shadowed by experiences that had shaped them in ways he had never intended. "There is another option," the Emperor said finally. "One that carries its own risks, but may prove necessary given our current limitations." The tactical display shifted again, showing genetic templates that bore an unmistakable resemblance to the Emperor's own divine essence. These were not the elaborate Primarch matrices that had been destroyed years earlier, but simplified patterns designed for mass production. Space Marine gene seed, derived directly from the master of mankind's genetic code. "Enhanced post-human warriors," explained Chief Genitor Arkan Land, his augmetic voice crackling with barely contained excitement. Using refined techniques from the abandoned Primarch project, we can create soldiers who bridge the gap between Thunder Warriors and Custodians, larger forces of transhuman warriors, each capable of superhuman tactical analysis and combat effectiveness. The proposal had been under development since the first reports of the scattered demigods had reached Imperial Command. Space Marines created not from Primarch gene seed, but from the Emperor's own genetic template, warriors who would be absolutely loyal because they would be crafted specifically for that purpose, without the unpredictable variables that had made the Primarch project so dangerous. "Production timelines?" asked General Loken. "First companies could be operational within 18 months, Land replied. Initial recruitment would draw from Thunder Warrior veterans and Custodian auxiliary forces. Genetic compatibility rates are promising. Approximately 73% of candidates should survive the enhancement process." Admiral Septimus consulted tactical projections flowing across his personal display. Deployment patterns would need to be carefully coordinated. Space Marine companies would serve as force multipliers for Thunder Warrior legions, providing superhuman leadership at the battalion and company level while maintaining mortal strategic command. It was a compromise solution. Not the godlike Primarchs who had been originally envisioned, but transhuman warriors who could provide the superhuman capabilities the Great Crusade desperately needed while remaining firmly under Imperial control. "There remains the question of the scattered demigods," Forge General Kelbor Howell observed, his augmetic voice carrying electronic harmonics. "Intelligence suggests they continue to expand their influence across multiple sectors. Some may prove amenable to Imperial alliance, but others may view our expansion as competition for their own territorial ambitions." The Emperor stood, his golden armor reflecting the light of distant stars displayed on the chamber's walls. Around him, the High Command Council waited for the decision that would shape the next phase of galactic conquest. "Begin Space Marine production immediately," the Emperor commanded. "Establish recruitment and training facilities on Terra, Mars, and Luna. Priority deployment to expedition fleets facing the most sophisticated opposition." He paused, his golden eyes reflecting calculations that spanned millennia. "And prepare covert reconnaissance missions to the worlds of the scattered demigods. We will observe them carefully before determining whether they can be approached as potential allies, or whether they must be treated as competitors for galactic dominion." As the Council dispersed to implement these new directives, General Sejanus remained behind to study the intelligence reports on the scattered superhuman leaders. His enhanced mind processed tactical scenarios at superhuman speed, calculating the military potential of beings who commanded worlds through capabilities that defied normal human limitations. The Great Crusade was evolving, shaped by necessity and the harsh realities of galactic conquest. Somewhere among the stars, godlike beings who had once been destined to serve as the Emperor's generals were building their own empires, guided by purposes that might or might not align with Imperial goals. The question that would define the next phase of human expansion was simple. When these scattered suns finally encountered the Great Crusade, would they stand as allies or enemies of the Imperium that had never known them as family? In the depths of space, fleets moved toward destinies that no one could predict, carrying warriors enhanced by science toward confrontations with beings enhanced by something far more mysterious and potentially far more dangerous. Chapter 5. Sons of Terra. The screams echoed through the medical bays of the Bucephalus as another Thunder Warrior succumbed to the genetic degradation that was slowly consuming the first generation of the Emperor's enhanced soldiers. Chief Apothecary Vaden Seth watched helplessly as the massive warrior's enhanced physiology turned against itself, muscle tissue breaking down faster than his augmented metabolism could repair it. Time of death, 1473. Terran Standard, Seth announced to the servo skulls recording the proceeding. Cause, cascading organ failure, consistent with accelerated genetic breakdown. Subject designation, Thunder Warrior, Primus Corvex, 23rd confirmed casualty this month. 5 years had passed since the Great Crusade's launch, and the hidden flaw in Thunder Warrior enhancement was finally revealing itself. The crude genetic modifications that had made them perfect for Terra's unification wars were proving unsuitable for extended galactic campaigning. What should have been humanity's immortal soldiers were dying by the hundreds, their superhuman bodies consuming themselves from within. In the depths of the flagship's most secure laboratory sections, a very different kind of enhancement was taking place. The first Space Marine Legion was being born, not from Primarch gene seed, as had been originally planned, but from genetic templates derived directly from the Emperor himself. The process was slower, more complex, and far more stable than anything that had come before. Batch 7 shows unprecedented compatibility rates, reported Chief Genitor Arkan Land, his augmetic implants interfacing directly with the genetic sequencing equipment. Survival rates have improved to 87%, with all successful subjects showing complete genetic stability. The Terran-born, as they have begun calling themselves, exhibit capabilities that significantly exceed baseline Thunder Warrior parameters. The Emperor stood before a vast observation window, watching as the first companies of Space Marines underwent training exercises in simulated combat environments. They were magnificent, each one a perfect fusion of human determination and superhuman capability, their gene-enhanced physiology granting them strength, speed, and resilience that made them living weapons of unprecedented effectiveness. Yet they were not what had been intended. Where the lost Primarchs would have been demigods capable of inspiring absolute loyalty through sheer presence, these Space Marines were enhanced mortals who followed orders through training and conditioning. Where Primarchs would have possessed strategic genius that bordered on supernatural, the Space Marines showed tactical competence that was impressive but fundamentally limited. They were superior soldiers, but they were not the leaders that the Great Crusade truly needed. The Thunder Warriors grow increasingly unstable, Konstantin Valdor reported, his voice carrying the weight of difficult decisions to come. Medical projections indicate complete unit breakdown within 2 years. We must consider retirement of the affected cohorts before their degradation becomes a liability to ongoing operations. The word retirement carried implications that everyone in the Strategium understood, but none wished to speak aloud. The Thunder Warriors had served with distinction for decades, first in the Unification Wars, and now in the early phases of galactic conquest. They had earned their place in history through blood and sacrifice, yet their genetic instability made them a growing danger to themselves and their comrades. There is another concern, Malkador observed, consulting intelligence reports marked with the highest classification seals. Our surveillance operations have identified Thunder Warrior survivors from the original Terra Purge who have been recruiting among the degrading cohorts. They speak of forming independent forces, free from imperial oversight. The specter of rogue Thunder Warriors had haunted imperial planners since the end of the Unification Wars. Unlike Space Marines, who were created with built-in loyalty conditioning, Thunder Warriors retained the fierce independence that had made them effective during Terra's conquest. If significant numbers abandoned imperial service, they could become a threat that would require serious military resources to contain. "Begin the great culling," the Emperor commanded, his golden eyes reflecting calculations that spanned tactical and strategic considerations across multiple timelines. Identify all Thunder Warriors showing signs of advanced degradation. Offer them the choice: retirement with honor or service in experimental programs that may extend their operational lifespan. It was a decision that would reshape the Imperial military, ending the age of the Thunder Warriors and fully transitioning to the new Space Marine legions. Yet even as this transformation proceeded, other intelligence was arriving that would complicate the Emperor's carefully laid plans. Surveillance Report Omega-77, announced Navigator Prima Isabeth, her third eye glowing with the strain of processing long-range psychic reconnaissance. Target designation: Chthonian System. Confirmation of superhuman leadership under subject designation Horus Lupercal. Local population refers to subject as the Sky-born King. Military capabilities assess at Primarch-level combat effectiveness. The main tactical display shifted to show grainy images captured by deep space reconnaissance probes. On the scarred mining world of Chthonian, a figure in crude but effective armor led gang warriors in campaigns that had unified the planet for the first time in recorded history. His strategic capabilities were undeniable: complex, multi-front campaigns executed with precision that suggested superhuman tactical processing abilities. More disturbing still were reports of his physical capabilities. Witnesses described a warrior who could tear through power armor with his bare hands, who moved with speed that made him nearly untargetable by conventional weapons, and whose mere presence inspired loyalty that bordered on religious devotion. Additional confirmations from Ultramar sector, continued the Navigator. Subject designation Robout Gilliman has expanded his domain to encompass 17 star systems. Administrative efficiency ratings exceed theoretical maximums for baseline human capability. Preliminary psychological profiles suggest strategic planning capabilities consistent with Primarch-level cognitive enhancement. And from the Caliban system, added another intelligence specialist, subject designation Lion L. Johnson has eliminated the last recorded great beast sighting in the sector. Combat effectiveness ratings suggest capabilities that exceed even custodian guard parameters. Local legends describe superhuman feats that border on the mythological. The Emperor listened to these reports with the expression of a father watching his children from afar, pride warring with concern in ways that his superhuman psychology struggled to reconcile. His sons had not only survived the destruction of their gestation pods, but had thrived, growing into the leaders he had always intended them to become. Yet they had done so without his guidance, shaped by experiences and environments he could not control or predict. Lord Emperor, General Sejanus ventured carefully, the strategic implications are significant. Each of these individuals commands resources that rival our expedition fleets. If they could be approached, persuaded to join the Great Crusade. The risks remain considerable, Valdor interrupted. We have no way of determining their psychological stability, their susceptibility to chaos corruption, or their willingness to accept imperial authority. The very independence that has made them successful leaders may make them unsuitable as subordinates. In the depths of the ship's medical bays, the great culling had begun. Thunder warriors who had served for decades were being quietly retired, their genetic instability making them liabilities that the Imperium could no longer afford. Some accepted their fate with the stoicism of professional soldiers. Others demanded the right to die in battle rather than waste away in medical facilities. A few simply disappeared. Rogue Thunder warrior activity confirmed in 3 sectors, reported Admiral Septimus from his fleet command station. Small units have abandoned their posts and vanished into the void. Intelligence suggests they may be attempting to establish independent operations beyond imperial oversight. These escapees represented a new kind of threat, enhanced warriors with decades of combat experience who no longer felt loyalty to the imperium that had created them. They possessed the knowledge of imperial tactics, technology, and strategic planning that could make them formidable opponents if they chose to oppose the Great Crusade. Yet even as these immediate concerns demanded attention, the Emperor's thoughts were drawn inexorably to his scattered sons. Through his enhanced senses, he could feel their psychic signatures like distant stars, each one unique and powerful in ways that no artificial enhancement could replicate. They were growing stronger with each passing year, their capabilities expanding beyond even his original projections. The question that haunted him was simple. When the time came for contact, would they welcome him as their father? Or would they see him as just another conqueror seeking to claim what they had built through their own efforts? "Continue surveillance operations," the Emperor commanded finally, "but begin preparation for direct contact protocols. We cannot remain observers forever. The Great Crusade requires the capabilities they represent, and they deserve to know their true origins." As the strategium cleared, each commander returning to oversee the massive logistical operation of transitioning from Thunder Warriors to Space Marines, the Emperor remained before the tactical displays showing the scattered domains of his sons. 3 of them confirmed, with reports suggesting that others might be building their own empires in distant sectors of the galaxy. The irony was not lost on him. In seeking to protect his children from chaos corruption, he had scattered them across the galaxy in a way that made them independent powers rather than loyal subordinates. Now, as the Space Marines took their place as the primary force of galactic conquest, he would have to decide whether to approach these lost sons as potential allies, or whether their very independence made them threats to the unified human empire he sought to create. In the medical bays, the last of the Thunder Warriors were being processed through retirement protocols, their age of dominance finally coming to an end. In the training facilities, Space Marines practiced the disciplines of war that would make them the instruments of human expansion. And in the depths of space, reconnaissance probes continued their silent watch over worlds where godlike beings ruled in the name of purposes that might or might not align with imperial goals. The Great Crusade was evolving, shaped by necessity and the unexpected consequences of choices made in desperation. Whether that evolution would lead to triumph or catastrophe remained to be seen. Chapter 6. The Watchers in the Dark. The ancient forests of Caliban had known silence for the first time in 10,000 years. Lionel Jonsson stood atop the ramparts of Alderuk, his fortress monastery carved into the living rock of the mountain, and surveyed the transformed landscape below. Where once the great beasts had stalked through primordial woodlands, now peaceful settlements dotted the valleys, their lights twinkling like fallen stars in the gathering dusk. Yet something was wrong. The lion's enhanced senses, honed through decades of hunting the most dangerous predators his world had ever known, detected subtle anomalies that would have been invisible to any baseline human. Electromagnetic signatures that didn't match Caliban's technology. Gravitational distortions consistent with void-capable vessels maintaining high orbit. Most unsettling of all, the feeling of being watched by eyes that operated beyond normal human perception. "My lord," announced Grandmaster Luthor, approaching with the respectful caution that the lion's presence always demanded. "The reconnaissance flights have detected unusual activity in the outer system. 3 separate incidents of sensor contacts that vanish when our patrol craft investigate." The lion turned from his contemplation of the forests, his pale eyes reflecting an intelligence that seemed almost predatory in its intensity. He had unified Caliban through a combination of martial prowess and strategic genius that had turned him from foundling knight into planetary ruler within 2 decades. Now, with the last great beast finally slain, he found himself confronting mysteries that extended beyond his homeworld. "Show me," he commanded. The tactical display in Aldoruk's command chamber showed Caliban's immediate stellar environment, with sensor traces marking the anomalous contacts that had been detected over recent months. The pattern was unmistakable to a mind trained in the arts of war, systematic surveillance by forces using technology far beyond anything Caliban possessed. "Whoever they are, they're being careful," the Lion observed, studying the tactical data with the same intensity he had once brought to tracking great beasts through ancient forests. Patient observation, minimal electromagnetic signature, withdrawal at first sign of detection, professional military reconnaissance. A similar realization was occurring in star systems across the galaxy as other superhuman leaders began to detect the Imperial surveillance networks that had been observing them for years. On Macraga, Robut Gilliman stood in the marble halls of his palace, reviewing reports that troubled him more with each passing hour. The Ultramar expansion had brought his forces into contact with expedition fleets bearing unfamiliar insignia, a double-headed eagle that seemed somehow familiar, though he could not place where he might have seen it before. "The contacts follow a consistent pattern," reported Chapter Master Marius Gage, consulting data slates filled with intelligence gathered from the frontier worlds. Ships of unknown but clearly advanced design, conducting what appear to be diplomatic surveys. They claim to represent something called the Imperium of Man, and speak of imperial compliance for human worlds. Guilliman studied the reports with the systematic thoroughness that had made him master of 500 worlds. These strangers possessed technology that matched or exceeded Ultramar's capabilities, but more importantly, they seemed to know things about human history that had been lost since the Age of Strife. Their representatives spoke of Terra as if it were more than legend, and their leader was referred to with titles that suggested a figure of almost mythical importance. "The Emperor of Mankind," Gilliman mused, the words carrying weight that he couldn't entirely explain. "Have we any records of such a figure in our historical archives?" "Fragmentary references only, my lord," replied Master of Archives Tarasha Uton. "Ancient texts speak of a golden figure who united Terra during the Age of Strife, but the details have been lost to time and distance. What's significant is that these strangers' accounts match the few reliable fragments we possess." Meanwhile, in the asteroid mining fields of Chthoniya, a very different kind of confrontation was taking place. Horus Lupercal, the sky-born king of Chthoniya, stood on the bridge of his captured cruiser, Vengeful Spirit, watching as Imperial vessels emerged from the warp at the edge of the system. Unlike the careful surveillance operations conducted elsewhere, this contact was happening in open space, with both sides fully aware of each other's presence. "They're requesting permission to approach," reported his lieutenant, a scarred veteran of the gang wars who had followed Horus since his earliest campaigns. "Standard diplomatic protocols, but their ships, I've never seen anything like them." Horus studied the alien elegance of the Imperial vessels through his ship's auger arrays. These were warships built by a civilization that had mastered technologies Chthoniya could barely comprehend, yet their representatives approached with the careful respect due to a sovereign power. It suggested these strangers, whoever they were, recognized him as an equal rather than a primitive to be conquered. "Grant them permission to approach," Horus decided, "but keep weapons charged and ready. Diplomacy is always preferable to war, but only when backed by the credible threat of violence." The first formal contact between a Primarch and Imperial forces was about to begin. Yet not all such encounters proceeded according to diplomatic protocols. On the death world of Fenris, Leman Russ of the Rout had detected the Imperial observation post through methods that had nothing to do with technology and everything to do with the predatory instincts that made him master of his harsh homeworld. The concealed facility, hidden in the ice caves of Fenris's northern continent, had been operating for months before the Wolf King's warriors finally tracked it down. "Imperial custodians," Russ announced to his assembled jarls, his voice carrying the satisfied tone of a hunter who had finally cornered his prey. "Golden-armored warriors whose scent speaks of ancient terror and the deep places beneath mountains. They've been watching us, measuring our strength like a wolf pack studying prey before the hunt." The assault had been swift and brutal. Fenrisian warriors armed with primitive weapons and enhanced by their harsh world's selective pressures had overwhelmed technology with sheer ferocity and tactical cunning. When the ice cleared, 3 custodians had been taken alive, the first time in recorded history that members of the Emperor's personal guard had been captured by any force. "They speak of a golden lord they call the Emperor," Russ reported, his pale eyes gleaming with an intensity that made even his battle-hardened warriors uneasy. "Their minds are conditioned against interrogation, but their loyalty is interesting. They serve not from fear or conditioning, but from something that resembles love. What manner of lord inspires such devotion?" The captured custodians had revealed little under questioning, but what they had shared painted a picture of an empire spanning thousands of worlds, led by a figure whose capabilities defied normal human understanding. Most unsettling of all, they had seemed to recognize something in Russ himself, as if they had been expecting to find someone like him on Fenris. Yet perhaps the most significant contact came not through ships or surveillance, but through the medium of the warp itself. Magnus the Red of Prospero had felt the psychic emanations of the Great Crusade long before any imperial vessel approached his world. From his crystal tower overlooking the City of Light, he had sensed the movement of vast fleets across the galaxy, guided by a psychic presence of staggering power and complexity. "The source is unmistakable," Magnus reported to his fellow scholars in the Corvidae cult, his single eye gleaming with eldritch knowledge. "A psyker of unprecedented capability, operating from the Sol system. The psychic emanations bear characteristics that suggest familiarity. Using techniques that pushed the boundaries of what was considered safe, Magnus had reached across the galaxy with his mind, seeking contact with the source of these emanations. What he found defied his understanding of what any single consciousness could contain. "My son." The words had echoed through the warp with a resonance that suggested vast age, infinite patience, and something that might have been love. Magnus had felt recognition flow between them, not memory, for he had no recollection of this presence, but something deeper than memory, a connection that existed at the genetic level, written into the very structure of his enhanced DNA. "Father." The psychic contact had lasted only moments, but it had been enough. Magnus now knew, with absolute certainty, that he was not alone in the galaxy, that somewhere among the stars was a being who shared his nature and had been searching for him across vast distances of space and time. Back aboard the Bucephalus, the Emperor felt the psychic contact like a solar flare across his enhanced consciousness. One of his sons had reached out to him directly, bypassing all the careful surveillance and diplomatic protocols that had been planned for eventual contact. "Magnus," he whispered, the name carrying weight that only he could fully understand. "The most gifted of my children, and the most dangerous." "Lord Emperor?" asked Malcador, sensing the sudden shift in his master's psychic emanations. "The time for observation has ended," the Emperor announced to the assembled High Command Council. "Our sons have begun to find us, whether through detection of our surveillance networks or through more direct means. We must decide quickly whether to approach them as potential allies or whether their very independence makes them threats to imperial unity." Around the strategium, the finest military minds baseline humanity could produce wrestled with strategic implications that would reshape the galaxy. The scattered Primarchs were no longer distant possibilities to be monitored from afar. They were becoming active forces in galactic politics, some seeking contact with the Imperium, while others viewed imperial expansion with suspicion or outright hostility. "The Fenris situation is particularly concerning," reported Constantin Valdor, his normally impassive expression showing the strain of having his men captured by primitive tribesmen. "Leman Russ has demonstrated capabilities that exceed our intelligence estimates, and his treatment of captured custodians suggests he views the Imperium as a potential threat rather than a long-lost family. While Magnus the Red's psychic contact suggests the opposite," added Chief Librarian Ahriman, one of the few Imperial psychers capable of analyzing such powerful psychic emanations. His mental emanations indicated recognition and what might be described as longing. The Emperor stood before the great tactical display, showing the current positions of all known Primarchs, each one a golden icon representing capabilities that could reshape the balance of galactic power. Some, like Guilliman, seemed potentially amenable to alliance. Others, like Russ, had already demonstrated hostility to Imperial presence. Still others remained mysteries, their intentions unknowable until direct contact could be established. "Prepare contact protocols for immediate implementation," the Emperor commanded. "The age of observation has ended. Now we must discover whether my sons will stand with the Imperium, or whether they will force us to consider them as competitors for galactic dominion." In the depths of space, reconnaissance fleets adjusted their courses toward worlds where godlike beings ruled in their own names. The next phase of the Great Crusade was about to begin. Not the conquest of primitive worlds, but the delicate negotiation with superhuman rulers who possessed the capability to stand as equals to the Imperium itself. The question that would determine the fate of humanity was simple. When father and sons finally met, would it be as family reunited or as enemies testing each other's strength? Chapter 7. The Prodigal Sons. The Great Hall of Ulduruk had witnessed many historic moments. The first knights of Caliban swearing their oaths, the final councils of war before the hunt for the last great beast, the ceremonies that had unified a world under a single banner. Yet none of those occasions had prepared Lionel Johnson for the sight of the golden figure who now stood before him in armor that seemed to capture and reflect the very essence of starlight. The Emperor of Mankind had come to Caliban in person, his presence filling the ancient stone chamber with an aura of power that made the air itself seem to thrum with barely contained energy. Behind him stood Constantin Valdor and a company of custodian guard, their golden armor marking them as the same warriors Leman Russ had captured on distant Fenris. Yet there was no hostility here, no weapons drawn or challenges issued. This was a reunion, not a conquest. "My son," the Emperor spoke, his voice carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate in dimensions beyond the merely physical. "I have come to bring you home." Lionel Johnson studied the figure before him with the same intensity he had once brought to hunting great beasts through Caliban's primordial forests. His enhanced senses detected no deception, no hidden threats, yet something about this meeting felt incomplete, as if crucial pieces of information remained concealed behind those ancient golden eyes. "You claim paternity," the lion replied carefully, his own voice carrying the authority of one who had commanded since childhood. "Yet I have no memory of you, no knowledge of how I came to be found in the forests of Caliban. If you are indeed my father, why did you abandon me to the wilderness?" The emperor's expression remained unchanged, but those who knew him well could detect the subtle tension that appeared around his eyes. "You were not abandoned, lion. You were lost, scattered by forces beyond my ability to prevent at the time. I have spent years searching for you and your brothers across the galaxy." "Brothers?" The lion's pale eyes sharpened with interest. "There are others like me?" 19 others, the Emperor confirmed, each scattered to different worlds, each growing to maturity under different circumstances. Some I have already found. Others like you, I am meeting for the first time since their creation. The revelation hung in the air between them, carrying implications that even the lion's strategic mind struggled to process. He was not unique. Somewhere across the galaxy were others who shared his nature, his capabilities, his enhanced physiology that made him more than human, but not quite divine. "What do you want of me?" the lion asked finally. "To join the Great Crusade," the Emperor replied, "to help me reunite the scattered worlds of humanity under a single banner. To take your rightful place as one of my generals in the greatest military campaign the galaxy has ever seen." Yet even as this first reunion unfolded on Caliban, other meetings across the galaxy were proving far more complex. On Macraga, Robut Gilliman sat across a marble table from representatives of the Imperium, including the Emperor himself, via HoloLink. The Lord of Ultramar had built something unprecedented, a small empire of 500 worlds that functioned with efficiency that bordered on the miraculous. Now he was being asked to subordinate that achievement to a larger empire he had played no role in creating. "The Imperium offers much," Gilliman observed, consulting data slates that contained detailed analysis of imperial administrative structures. Advanced technology, trade networks spanning thousands of worlds, military support against external threats. Yet what it asks in return is the dissolution of everything I have built here. Not dissolution, the Emperor clarified through the flickering hologram. Integration. Ultramar would become a sector of the Imperium, maintaining its current efficiency while contributing to the greater whole. You would retain significant autonomy in local governance. Under whose authority? Guilliman pressed. I have spent decades perfecting administrative systems that ensure optimal resource allocation and population welfare. Who in your Imperium possesses the knowledge to oversee such systems without degrading their effectiveness? It was a question that cut to the heart of the integration problem. Gilliman had built Ultramar through superhuman intellect and careful planning. The Imperium, for all its military might, was still largely administered by enhanced mortals whose capabilities, impressive as they were, fell far short of Primarch-level cognitive processing. Meanwhile, on the mining world of Chthoniya, a very different kind of negotiation was taking place. Horus Lupercal stood on the observation deck of his flagship, watching Imperial vessels take position around Chthoniya, with the appreciation of a professional warrior evaluating superior technology. Unlike his brothers, he felt no resentment at being approached by a larger power. Instead, he saw opportunity. Your great crusade requires leadership capable of strategic thinking across multiple theaters of operation, Horus observed to Admiral Sejanus, who had been dispatched as the primary Imperial negotiator. From what you've described, your current command structure relies heavily on enhanced mortals and direct Imperial oversight. That approach may work for compliant worlds, but it lacks the flexibility required for truly complex campaigns. Sejanus found himself impressed despite his initial skepticism. The skyborn king of Chthoniya possessed a combination of tactical brilliance and natural charisma that reminded him of the greatest mortal commanders, yet magnified beyond normal human capability. More importantly, Horus seemed genuinely interested in the Imperium's strategic challenges rather than focused solely on his own position. "What do you propose?" Sejanus asked. "A partnership," Horus replied. "I bring my forces and my capabilities to the Great Crusade, not as a subordinate commander, but as a partner in the enterprise. Your emperor gains a general capable of independent strategic thinking and complex campaign management. I gain access to resources and technology that will allow achievements far beyond what any single world could accomplish." It was exactly the kind of pragmatic arrangement that imperial planners had hoped for, yet it came with implications that made the High Command Council uneasy. Horus was clearly capable of serving as a War Master-level commander, but accepting his partnership would mean acknowledging that the Imperium needed capabilities it currently lacked. Other reunions were proving even more challenging. On Chemos, Fulgrim the Phoenician reviewed imperial manufacturing standards with the meticulous attention to detail that had transformed his adoptive world from a dying husk into a center of artistic and technological achievement. What he found disturbed him profoundly. "These specifications are adequate," Fulgrim announced to the imperial delegation, his voice carrying disapproval that was all the more cutting for being delivered with perfect courtesy. "Functional, efficient, but they show no aspiration toward perfection, no recognition that excellence should be the minimum acceptable standard rather than an occasional goal." The imperial representatives exchanged glances of barely concealed frustration. Fulgrim had spent hours reviewing everything from bolt weapon tolerances to power armor aesthetic details, finding flaws and inefficiencies that he insisted could be corrected through what he termed proper attention to excellence. "The Great Crusade operates under constraints that require compromise between perfection and production capacity," explained Forge General Kelbor Hall through his Vox grill. "We must equip millions of soldiers across thousands of worlds. Absolute perfection in each component would slow production to unacceptable levels." "Then your constraints are flawed," Fulgrim replied simply. "True efficiency comes from doing things correctly the first time, not from accepting mediocrity and dealing with the consequences later." On distant Nocturne, Vulcan confronted a different kind of philosophical clash with imperial doctrine. The Salamander Primarch had built a society based on craftsmanship, community, and the protection of those too weak to defend themselves. Imperial military doctrine, with its emphasis on acceptable casualty rates and strategic necessity, struck him as fundamentally inhumane. "You speak of compliance campaigns as if they were purely military operations," Vulcan observed during his meetings with imperial representatives. "But every world you conquer contains populations who must be protected, cultures that must be preserved, children who must be kept safe during the transition to imperial rule. Where in your doctrines do I find recognition of these humanitarian concerns?" The questions raised by each reunion were complex enough individually. Collectively, they represented a crisis that threatened to derail the entire Great Crusade. The Council of Nicaea had been hastily organized aboard the Bucephalus to address the integration crisis before it could spiral beyond control. Representatives from across the Imperium gathered in the Great Strategium to determine how superhuman Primarchs could be integrated into command structures designed for enhanced mortals. The Emperor sat at the head of the great table, his golden armor reflecting the light of holographic displays showing the current disposition of Imperial forces across known space. Around him sat the members of the High Command Council, now joined by the Primarchs who had agreed to attend. The contrast between enhanced mortals and their superhuman counterparts was striking, not just in physical presence, but in the scope and depth of their strategic thinking. The fundamental question, the Emperor announced to the assembled delegates, is whether the Great Crusade can accommodate multiple command philosophies without losing strategic coherence. Each of my sons brings capabilities that exceed anything we have previously possessed. Yet their integration into existing structures requires changes that may disrupt our current operational effectiveness. General Sejanus shifted uncomfortably in his chair. For years he had served as the primary strategic coordinator for the Great Crusade, his enhanced intellect allowing him to manage complex multi-theater campaigns. Now he found himself working alongside beings whose cognitive capabilities made his achievements seem modest by comparison. The Primarchs represent exactly the kind of superhuman leadership our campaigns have been lacking, Sejanus admitted with the honesty of a professional soldier. Their capabilities could solve strategic problems that have been limiting our expansion rate. Yet accommodating their command styles will require fundamental changes to doctrine and organization. Changes that may prove disruptive during a critical phase of galactic conquest, added Constantine Valdor. The Great Crusade has momentum. Altering command structures now risks introducing inefficiencies that could slow our progress or create opportunities for our enemies. Horus leaned forward, his presence commanding attention even among such distinguished company. The alternative is accepting limitations that will become increasingly costly as we encounter more sophisticated opposition. The galaxy contains threats that require capabilities beyond what enhanced mortals can provide, no matter how skillfully they are deployed. Then we must find a balance, the Emperor declared, a structure that allows my sons to contribute their full capabilities while maintaining the operational effectiveness we have achieved through existing systems. The debate that followed would reshape the structure of the Great Crusade. Some Primarchs, like Horus, would be granted independent command authority over entire expedition fleets. Others, like Guilliman, would maintain autonomous control over their domains while contributing forces to imperial campaigns. Still others would integrate their capabilities into existing command structures in ways that preserved both their unique gifts and the Imperium's strategic coherence. Yet even as these compromises were hammered out through hours of careful negotiation, underlying tensions remained. The Primarchs had grown to maturity as independent rulers, their personalities and philosophies shaped by experiences the Emperor could not control or predict. Integrating them into the Imperium would require constant balancing of their individual strengths against the requirements of unified command. The age of the scattered suns was ending. The age of integration was about to begin. Whether that integration would strengthen the Great Crusade or tear it apart remained to be seen. Chapter 8. Brothers in Discord. The slave pits of Nuceria burned with a light that had nothing to do with the planet's twin suns. Across the gladiatorial arenas that had defined the world's culture for millennia, bodies lay scattered like broken dolls, the corpses of slavers, arena guards, and anyone else who had stood between the gladiators and their freedom. At the center of the carnage stood a figure whose presence seemed to radiate violence, like heat from a forge. Angron, the Red Angel of Nuceria, had finally broken his chains. The revolt had begun 3 days earlier, triggered by the arrival of Imperial forces who had come to negotiate the planet's compliance. Unlike other worlds, where such negotiations proceeded through established diplomatic channels, Nuceria's rulers had insisted on demonstrating their world's martial traditions through gladiatorial combat. They had not expected their prize gladiator to refuse to fight for their entertainment any longer. "The High Riders are dead," announced Captain Khan, one of the few gladiators who had survived the initial uprising alongside their superhuman leader. Blood covered his scarred features, but his eyes burned with the fierce joy of a warrior who had finally found a cause worth dying for. The slave quarters are secure, the arena masters. They won't be needing their whips anymore. Angron stood among the ruins of what had once been the Deshair Colosseum, his enhanced senses tracking the approach of Imperial forces through the smoke and chaos. The brass implants that the slavers had driven into his skull throbbed with constant agony, a reminder of decades spent fighting for the amusement of creatures he considered beneath contempt. "Lord Angron," called a voice from the arena's shattered entrance. Imperial officers in pristine uniforms approached cautiously, their enhanced bodyguards ready for violence, but clearly hoping to avoid it. "I am General Marcus Valerius of the 847th Expeditionary Fleet. We have come to discuss your world's integration into the imperium of man." Angron's pale eyes fixed on the imperial delegation with an intensity that made several of the officers step backward, despite their enhanced courage conditioning. Here was another set of masters, come to negotiate for his services, as if he were property to be traded, rather than a being with his own will and desires. Integration? Angron's voice carried harmonics that seemed to resonate with the screams of dying slavers. "You mean slavery with different masters. I have broken my chains once. I will not forge new ones for your convenience." The confrontation that followed would be recorded in Imperial histories as the Broken Chain Incident, the first time a Primarch openly defied Imperial authority. Angron's demands were simple: complete autonomy for his gladiator armies, the right to wage war according to his own philosophy, and freedom from any command structure that resembled the slavery he had endured. When the Imperial delegation attempted to explain the necessity of unified command, Angron's response was swift and brutal. General Valerius never left Nuceria alive. Meanwhile, in the siege trenches surrounding the fortress city of Olympia, a very different kind of confrontation was developing. Perturabo, the Lord of Iron, stood before tactical displays that showed the systematic reduction of the last stronghold resisting Imperial compliance. His approach to warfare was methodical, precise, and devastatingly effective, but it required resources that the existing Imperial command structure was reluctant to provide. The Iron Warriors required dedicated siege equipment, specialized ammunition, and engineering support that exceeds standard expedition fleet allocations, Perturabo reported to Admiral Septimus via long-range Vox transmission. Current Imperial doctrine prioritizes rapid compliance over thorough reduction of enemy fortifications. This approach is fundamentally flawed when dealing with sophisticated defensive positions. The Lord of Iron had proven his worth repeatedly during the compliance campaigns of the Olympia sector. His engineering expertise and tactical genius had broken sieges that had stalled other Imperial forces for months. Yet his methods required resources that conflicted with the Great Crusade's emphasis on rapid expansion across multiple theaters. "Lord Perturabo," Admiral Septimus replied carefully, "the Imperium recognizes your exceptional capabilities. However, allocating the resources you request would require reducing support for other expedition fleets. The High Command Council must balance effectiveness against operational tempo across the entire crusade." "Then the High Command Council lacks understanding of siege warfare," Perturabo responded, with the blunt honesty that had made him few friends among Imperial diplomats. Assigning inadequate resources to complex operations guarantees either failure or Pyrrhic victories that weaken overall campaign effectiveness. I require my own legion, equipped and organized according to siege warfare requirements, not compromised by administrators who mistake rapidity for efficiency. It was a demand that struck at the heart of imperial command philosophy. The Emperor had designed the Great Crusade around flexibility and rapid deployment, using mixed forces that could adapt to various threats. Perturabo's insistence on specialized siege legions represented a fundamental challenge to that doctrine. On distant Barbarous, another Primarch was creating different but equally serious problems for imperial integration. Mortarion, the Death Lord, had unified his poison-shrouded homeworld through a combination of personal courage and absolute refusal to compromise with corruption in any form. When imperial representatives attempted to explain the complex political realities of galactic governance, they found themselves confronting a being whose moral certainty was as absolute as his resistance to toxic environments. "You speak of necessary compromises," Mortarion observed, his rebreather unit casting eerie shadows across his pale features. "Alliances with Xenos species, when convenient. Trade agreements with human worlds whose governments exploit their populations. Administrative efficiency that prioritizes compliance over justice. I have spent my life fighting corruption. I will not serve a system that institutionalizes it." The Death Guard that Mortarion had forged from Barbarous's survivors shared their Gene Father's uncompromising approach to authority. They followed orders that aligned with their moral convictions, but questioned or outright refused directives that seemed to compromise their principles. Imperial commanders found themselves dealing with superhuman warriors who treated military hierarchy as advisory rather than absolute. Yet perhaps the most concerning development was occurring on the word-bearer homeworld of Colchis, where religious fervor was creating theological conflicts that threatened the very foundations of imperial ideology. Lorgar Aurelian, the Golden One of Colchis, had built a civilization based on spiritual devotion and religious unity. His people worshipped the concept of divine truth with an intensity that made them extraordinarily loyal, but also fundamentally incompatible with the imperial truth's secular rationalism. "The Emperor denies his own divinity," Lorgar proclaimed to his assembled word-bearers, his voice carrying the passionate conviction that had converted entire populations to his cause. Yet his achievements transcend anything possible through purely mortal means. To deny the spiritual dimension of his nature is to diminish both his greatness and our service to his cause. Imperial observers reported growing concerns about the word-bearers' religious practices. Their battle cries invoked divine protection. Their ceremonies resembled religious worship more than military discipline, and their treatment of the Emperor bordered on the kind of superstitious reverence that the imperial truth had been designed to eliminate. Most disturbing of all were the activities being conducted by the newest Primarch to be discovered. Alpharius, the last Primarch, had been found leading a network of operatives whose capabilities and methods defied conventional understanding. Unlike his brothers, who commanded through open leadership and personal charisma, Alpharius operated through infiltration, misdirection, and information warfare that made it impossible to determine his true loyalties or intentions. Alpha Legion operatives have been detected within Imperial command structures across 7 expedition fleets, reported Chief Interrogator Erasmus Golg, consulting classified intelligence reports that had required weeks to compile. Their infiltration methods suggest capabilities that exceed standard reconnaissance protocols. More concerning, their objectives remain unclear. The Alpha Legion's approach to warfare was fundamentally different from any other Imperial force. They operated through networks of agents who could assume false identities with such perfection that they became virtually undetectable. Their battle doctrine emphasized deception and information control over direct confrontation, making them invaluable for certain types of operations, but deeply unsettling to commanders who preferred straightforward military solutions. Alfarius claims his operatives are gathering intelligence to support imperial expansion, added Constantin Valdor, though his tone suggested skepticism about such explanations. However, his methods raise questions about operational security and command loyalty that we have never previously faced. The cumulative effect of these developments was creating fractures within the Great Crusade that threatened its fundamental unity. Some Primarchs, like Horus and Guilliman, had integrated relatively smoothly into imperial structures. Others were demanding changes that would require fundamental alterations to doctrine and organization. Still others were actively resisting aspects of imperial authority that conflicted with their personal philosophies. The breaking point came during the pacification of the Genna system, where multiple expedition fleets had been deployed to crush a particularly stubborn Xenos presence. The operation required coordination between Ungron's gladiator warriors, Perturabo's siege specialists, and conventional imperial forces under mortal command. General Sejanus, serving as overall operational commander, attempted to deploy the Primarch forces according to standard imperial doctrine. Angron's warriors would serve as shock troops for initial assault. Perturabo's forces would reduce fortified positions, and regular imperial forces would secure objectives and maintain supply lines. The plan fell apart within hours of implementation. Angron refused to accept casualties among his gladiator brothers for objectives he considered strategically worthless. Perturabo demanded resources that would delay other operations for months. When Sejanus attempted to assert command authority, both Primarchs simply ignored his orders and began conducting independent operations according to their own strategic priorities. This is the fundamental problem, Sejanus reported to the Emperor after the Genna operation devolved into chaos. The Primarchs possess capabilities we desperately need, but their integration into existing command structures is proving impossible. They think on scales and according to principles that make them incompatible with unified strategic direction. The Emperor listened to these reports with the patient attention of someone who had witnessed the rise and fall of countless civilizations. Around him, the High Command Council struggled with strategic problems that had no easy solutions. The Primarchs represented exactly the kind of superhuman leadership the Great Crusade required, yet their individual approaches to warfare and governance were creating conflicts that threatened to tear the Imperium apart. Perhaps, suggested Malcador quietly, we must consider whether unity is more important than capability. The Great Crusade requires both strategic coherence and superhuman effectiveness. If we cannot achieve both simultaneously, we must choose which takes precedence. It was a choice that would define the future of human expansion across the galaxy. Accept the limitations of mortal leadership and maintain unified command, or accommodate superhuman capabilities and risk fragmentation that could doom the entire enterprise. As reports continued to arrive from across the galaxy, Primarchs demanding autonomy, mortal commanders struggling with superhuman subordinates, and growing evidence that some of the lost suns were developing in ways that aligned poorly with imperial values, the Emperor faced a decision that would reshape the Great Crusade. The age of integration was proving more challenging than anyone had anticipated. Whether it would end in triumph or catastrophe remained to be seen. Chapter 9. The Istvan Choice. The astropathic choir aboard the Bucephalus screamed in unison as the message tore through the warp, carrying news that would force the Emperor to confront the fundamental contradictions in his strategy for galactic conquest. Across the ship's command decks, officers and analysts struggled to process intelligence reports that painted a picture of rebellion unlike anything the Great Crusade had previously encountered. The Istvan system has declared independence from the Imperium, reported navigator Primarchs, her third eye weeping blood from the psychic trauma of receiving such violently charged communications. 3 inhabited worlds, 17 orbital stations, and a void-capable fleet estimated at 200 vessels. But that's not the worst of it. The main tactical display in the Strategium shifted to show long-range augury scans of the Istvan system. What should have been familiar human settlements and defensive installations showed technological signatures that defied explanation. Weapons platforms of clearly non-human design orbited the system's primary world, while energy readings suggested defensive capabilities that exceeded anything in Imperial arsenals. Xenos support confirmed, announced Magos Reductor in Arkek, his augmetic implants processing data streams that would have overwhelmed baseline human cognition. Technological analysis indicates significant alien presence, weapons signatures consistent with previously unknown species, estimated threat level, maximal. The Emperor stood before the tactical display with an expression that revealed nothing of his thoughts. Yet those who had served him longest could sense the tension radiating from his golden form. This was exactly the kind of crisis that had driven him to create the Primarchs in the first place, a threat that required superhuman leadership and capabilities beyond what enhanced mortals could provide. Rebellion supported by Xenos allies represents a threat to the fundamental principles of the Great Crusade, observed General Sejanus, his enhanced mind already calculating the strategic implications. If successful, it could inspire similar uprisings across multiple sectors. The example must be crushed quickly and decisively. Around the Strategium, the High Command Council assembled to wrestle with a decision that would test everything the Imperium had built over the past decades. The Istvan Rebellion was not simply a political uprising. It was a military challenge that demanded responses the Imperial war machine had never been forced to provide. "I volunteer to lead the campaign," Sejanus announced, his voice carrying the confidence of a commander who had never tasted defeat. "Give me the 12th and 23rd Expeditionary Fleets, the surviving Thunder Warrior cohorts, and 3 companies of Terran-born Space Marines. We'll break this rebellion within 6 months and demonstrate that Imperial authority requires no superhuman intervention to maintain." It was exactly the kind of response that Imperial doctrine had been designed to provide. Sejanus possessed the tactical genius and enhanced capabilities needed to coordinate complex multi-fleet operations. The surviving Thunder Warriors, despite their genetic instabilities, still represented the finest assault troops in Imperial service. The new Space Marine companies had proven themselves in dozens of compliance actions across the galaxy. Yet from across the Strategium, Horus Lupercal stepped forward with the fluid grace that marked him as something beyond merely human. "With respect to General Sejanus," Horus said, his voice carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate in ways that normal human vocal cords could never achieve, "this rebellion represents exactly the kind of threat that requires Primarch-level leadership. Xenos-supported uprisings cannot be crushed through conventional tactics and overwhelming force alone." The Skyborn King of Chthoniya had spent months studying Imperial command structures and strategic doctrine since his integration into the Great Crusade. Unlike some of his brothers, he understood the delicate balance between superhuman capabilities and existing military hierarchy. Yet he also recognized when that balance was inadequate for the challenges being faced. The Istvan system's defenses suggest strategic planning that exceeds normal human capability, Horus continued, consulting tactical data streams with superhuman speed. Xenos technology integrated with human rebellious fervor creates tactical variables that require adaptive thinking beyond enhanced mortal parameters. This campaign needs Legion deployment under Primarch command. The argument that followed would be dissected by Imperial strategists for decades afterward. Sejanus, supported by the majority of the High Command Council, insisted that establishing precedent for Primarch-only responses to major threats would undermine the entire command structure they had built. Horus, backed by several of his brothers who had been monitoring the discussion via long-range communication, argued that refusing to deploy appropriate capabilities against existential threats was strategic suicide disguised as administrative consistency. "The fundamental question," the Emperor said finally, his golden eyes reflecting calculations that spanned tactical, strategic, and political considerations across multiple timelines, "is whether we respond to this crisis according to existing doctrine or adapt our approach based on the specific nature of the threat." The decision that followed attempted to satisfy both perspectives, and in doing so, satisfied neither. "General Sejanus will serve as overall operational commander," the Emperor announced. "He will deploy with standard Imperial forces as planned. However, Primarchs Horus, Ferrus Manus, and Fulgrim will accompany the expedition with their personal forces, serving as specialized assault commanders under General Sejanus's strategic direction." It was a compromise that preserved the chain of command while acknowledging the need for superhuman capabilities. Mortal leadership would maintain overall control, but Primarch-level tactical genius would be available for the most challenging operations. In theory, it represented the optimal fusion of Imperial doctrine with superhuman enhancement. In practice, it created a command structure doomed to failure. The fleet that translated into the Istvan system 3 months later represented the largest single military operation the Great Crusade had ever attempted. 200 Imperial vessels, carrying 50,000 Thunder Warriors, 30,000 Terran-born Space Marines, and the personal forces of 3 Primarchs, emerged from the warp to face a rebellion that had grown far beyond initial intelligence estimates. "Enemy fleet strength now estimated at 400 vessels," reported Admiral Marcus Valerius from his flagship Iron Justice. "Technological capabilities unprecedented. They're deploying weapons that our cogitators cannot classify." The Istvan rebels had used the months since their declaration of independence to fortify their system with alien technology that transformed every world and orbital station into a weapons platform. More disturbing still were the energy readings that suggested capabilities beyond mere military enhancement, patterns that reminded Imperial psychers of the kind of warp manipulation they had been trained to recognize and fear. "Command structure breakdown confirmed," reported Captain Garviel Loken, commanding the lead Thunder Warrior assault companies. "General Sejanus is ordering standard orbital bombardment, followed by surface assault. Primarch Horus is requesting permission to conduct reconnaissance in force to identify alien defensive capabilities. Primarch Ferrus Manus insists on immediate full-scale assault to test enemy resolve. Orders are contradictory." The battle for Istvan III began with the kind of confusion that tactical doctrine had been specifically designed to prevent. Imperial forces approached the planet under 3 different strategic philosophies. Their coordination degraded by commanders, whose enhanced capabilities made them incapable of subordinating their judgment to unified direction. Sejanus, operating according to standard Imperial doctrine, ordered orbital bombardment to soften planetary defenses before launching surface assaults. Horus, recognizing the alien nature of the defensive systems, attempted to conduct careful probing attacks to identify weaknesses. Ferrus Manus, driven by his iron determination to test both his forces and the enemy through direct confrontation, launched immediate assault operations regardless of preparation status. The result was catastrophic. Enemy response exceeds all projections, transmitted Captain Saul Tarvitz from the surface of Istvan 3, his Vox signal crackling with interference from exotic energy weapons. They're not just using alien technology, they're using it with tactical coordination that suggests non-human strategic planning. Request immediate reinforcement or authorization for tactical withdrawal. The alien-enhanced rebels had turned Istvan 3 into a killing field that consumed Imperial forces faster than they could be deployed. Worse still, the divided command structure meant that each Imperial force was operating according to different tactical assumptions, creating gaps in coordination that the enemy exploited with ruthless efficiency. "This is impossible," General Sejanus transmitted from his command center aboard the Bucephalus. "Enhanced human rebels cannot be coordinating operations at this level of sophistication. Something else is directing their strategic planning." The answer came in the form of weapons that should not have existed. The virus bombs that erupted across Istvan 3 were not of alien manufacture, nor were they drawn from the weapon stockpiles that the rebels should have possessed. These were Imperial weapons, biological warfare devices whose existence was known only to the highest levels of Imperial command. Yet somehow, the Istvan rebels had gained access to them and deployed them with surgical precision that targeted both Imperial and alien forces simultaneously. "Life-eater virus confirmed," reported Chief Apothecary Fabius through emergency communication protocols. "Deployment pattern suggests inside knowledge of Imperial force dispositions. Casualties extensive. The virus bombing killed indiscriminately. Thunder warriors died alongside Space Marines, while Primarchs watched their enhanced physiology barely protect them from weapons designed to consume all organic life. Within hours, the surface of Istvan 3 had been transformed into a charnel house that made mockery of Imperial tactical superiority. Yet even as the immediate crisis unfolded, deeper truths were emerging from the carnage. "The rebels knew," transmitted Horus from his position in the planet's upper atmosphere, his voice carrying a note of recognition that would haunt him for years afterward. "They knew our force dispositions, our tactical doctrines, our command structure weaknesses. This wasn't rebellion. It was an orchestrated test." Magnus the Red's psychic voice reached across the void from distant Prospero, carrying knowledge that had cost him dearly to acquire. "Brother, do you not sense them? The powers that move behind this rebellion? The same forces that scattered us as children now turn Imperial strength against itself." The revelation hit the Imperial command structure like a psychic thunderbolt. The Istvan rebellion had not been about independence or alien alliance. It had been about forcing the Imperium to deploy its most valuable assets in a situation where they could be destroyed or corrupted. The same chaos powers that had once sought to claim the Primarchs were now attempting to turn Imperial capabilities against themselves. "Chaos!" The Emperor spoke, the single word carrying weight that made reality itself seem to shudder. "The ruinous powers have found another way to strike at my plans." The survivors of Istvan limped back to Imperial space, carrying news that would reshape everything about the Great Crusade. General Sejanus had died in the virus bombing, along with most of the High Command Council and thousands of the Imperium's finest warriors. The Primarchs had survived, but their exposure to chaos corruption during the campaign had left marks that would never fully heal. Most importantly, the fundamental weakness of the Emperor's compromise approach had been exposed for all to see. Attempting to balance superhuman capabilities with mortal command structures had created exactly the kind of confusion that humanity's enemies could exploit. "The choice is clear now," Horus reported, during the debriefing sessions that followed the Istvan disaster. "Either trust your sons to lead as we were meant to lead, or accept that the Great Crusade will continue to face defeats like this whenever it encounters enemies who understand our weaknesses. The Emperor looked upon his surviving commanders, mortal and superhuman alike, and faced the reality that his careful compromise had failed. The galaxy contained threats that required capabilities beyond what enhanced mortals could provide, yet granting those capabilities to his Primarchs meant accepting risks he had spent decades trying to avoid. The Istvan choice had been made for him. Now he would have to live with the consequences. Chapter 10. The Heresy That Never Was. The Vox transmission that reached Terra 6 months after the Istvan disaster should have been impossible. General Hastor Sejanus had been confirmed dead, his life signs lost during the virus bombing that had devastated the planet's surface. Yet the voice that crackled through the astropathic networks carried his distinctive tonal patterns, his tactical phraseology, and his command authority, along with something else that made the custodian guard reach for their weapons despite the speaker's identity. "Citizens of the Imperium," the voice announced across emergency broadcast frequencies, "you have been deceived. The figure you worship as the Emperor of mankind is a false idol, a tyrant who hoards the power of godhood while denying humanity its rightful place among the divine. I speak to you now as one who has seen the truth, who has gazed upon the real powers that govern the galaxy, and found them willing to share their gifts with those bold enough to claim them." The transmission originated from the Outer Rim territories, where rogue Imperial forces had been gathering for months under the banner of what they called the true Imperium. These were not alien invaders or primitive rebels, but enhanced Imperial soldiers, experienced fleet commanders, and veteran Thunder warriors who had abandoned their oaths to serve a different kind of master. "Sejanus lives," Constantin Valdor reported to the assembled High Command Council, though his normally impassive expression showed the strain of processing intelligence that defied rational explanation. Medical analysis of his broadcast patterns confirms genetic and cybernetic markers consistent with his identity. Yet the figure speaking is changed, enhanced beyond normal parameters through means we cannot identify. The Emperor stood before the great tactical display in the Strategium, watching as red icons marked the growing strength of the rebel forces. Each symbol represented Imperial assets that had been turned against the Imperium itself, ships whose crews had declared for the true Emperor, planets whose governors had renounced Imperial authority, and most disturbing of all, Thunder warriors whose genetic instabilities had been somehow stabilized through corruption that made them more dangerous than they had ever been as loyal servants. The corruption began before Istvan, reported Chief Interrogator Erasmus Golg, consulting intelligence reports that painted a picture of subversion spanning years rather than months. Retrospective analysis indicates that Thunder warrior survivors from the original Terra Purge had been recruiting among degrading cohorts for decades. They offered genetic stabilization in exchange for alternative loyalties. The pattern was becoming clear with horrifying inevitability. The rogue Thunder warriors who had escaped Imperial retirement programs had not simply formed independent mercenary bands. They had been corrupted by the same chaos powers that had scattered the Primarchs, turned into vectors for spreading corruption throughout Imperial military structures. Every Thunder warrior they had recruited became another agent of subversion, carrying chaos influence into the heart of Imperial forces. Fleet Admiral Saul Tarvitz of the 17th Expeditionary Fleet has declared for the true Emperor, reported Admiral Marcus Valerius, his voice carrying the shock of betrayal. 3 entire expedition fleets have abandoned their compliance campaigns and are moving toward the Maelstrom region. Ship manifests indicate they're carrying approximately 40,000 corrupted Thunder Warriors and an unknown number of compromised Space Marines. The rebellion was spreading faster than Imperial forces could respond. Unlike the Primarch-led uprisings that Imperial planners had prepared for, this was a corruption that struck at the very foundations of Imperial military doctrine. These rebels knew Imperial tactics, communication protocols, and strategic weaknesses because they had helped develop them. General Corith Kane of the 12th Thunder Warrior Legion has issued a proclamation, continued Valerius, consulting data slates with hands that trembled slightly despite his enhanced physiology. He claims the Emperor has been withholding genetic enhancement techniques that could eliminate Thunder Warrior degradation. His forces have seized the gene labs on Luna and are reportedly experimenting on captured Imperial personnel. Yet even as this mortal heresy consumed Imperial forces from within, the Primarchs found themselves facing choices that would define their relationship with their father forever. On Mars, the red planet burned with fires that had nothing to do with its forge furnaces. Forge General Kelbor Hall, corrupted by decades of exposure to forbidden knowledge during his service to the Great Crusade, had declared the Mechanicum's independence from Imperial authority. His proclamation spoke of pure knowledge and freedom from the tyranny of ignorance, in terms that would have been inspiring if not for the reports of what his research had produced. The siege of Mars has entered its third week, transmitted Primarch Ferrus Manus from his position with the Loyalist Mechanicum forces attempting to retake the planet. Kelbor Hall has transformed the forges into something unrecognizable. His war machines incorporate technologies that should not exist, powered by energies that make our augurs scream in feedback loops. The corrupted Forge General had turned Mars into a nightmare of twisted metal and impossible geometries, where demon engines stalked through assembly lines that now produced weapons designed to unmake reality itself. Worse still, his rebellion was spreading throughout the Mechanicum, as tech priests who had served the Emperor for decades suddenly declared their loyalty to higher powers that promised unlimited knowledge in exchange for moral compromise. Several night houses have declared for Kelbor Hall, Ferrus Manus continued, his vox transmission carrying the sound of weapons fire that seemed to echo in dimensions beyond the merely physical. Their war engines bear symbols that hurt to look upon directly. My iron hands report that our weapons are less effective against these corrupted machines than they should be, as if reality itself bends around them. From distant Prospero, Magnus the Red's psychic voice reached across the void with warnings that came too late to prevent the catastrophe, but might still limit its scope. Father, Magnus transmitted through the warp, his mental emanations carrying pain that went beyond physical injury. I have gazed into the heart of this corruption and seen its source. The powers that scattered us as children have spent decades preparing for this moment. They knew that mortal commanders would be more susceptible to corruption than Primarchs bound by genetic loyalty. Every Thunder Warrior who escaped retirement, every general who felt overlooked for promotion, every fleet captain who resented Imperial oversight, all were potential vectors for the corruption they have been spreading. The revelation hit the Imperial command structure like a psychic thunderbolt. The Emperor's decision to rely on enhanced mortals rather than risk Primarch corruption had simply provided the Chaos powers with different targets, ones who lacked the genetic conditioning and supernatural willpower that made Primarchs resistant to corruption. The irony is almost perfect, Magnus continued, his psychic voice carrying bitter understanding. In seeking to protect your sons from corruption, you created an empire vulnerable to the very forces you sought to avoid. The Chaos powers care nothing for the specific nature of their tools. They simply corrupt whatever is available. Across the galaxy, the scattered Primarchs found themselves choosing sides in a conflict that would reshape the future of human civilization. Some, like Horus and Gilliman, declared their absolute loyalty to the Emperor, despite their previous conflicts with imperial authority. Others, like Lion L. Johnson and Vulcan, chose to remain neutral while protecting their own domains from the spreading corruption. Still others simply vanished, their ultimate loyalties unknown as the galaxy burned around them. Primarch Lehman Russ has declared the Space Wolves an independent force, reported Captain Garviel Loken, one of the few remaining loyal Thunder Warrior commanders. He claims that both the Emperor and the False Emperor are equally flawed, and that Fenris will follow neither. His fleets are reportedly moving toward Terra, but his intentions remain unclear. The Emperor listened to these reports with the expression of someone watching carefully, laid plans crumble into chaos, which, he reflected with bitter irony, was exactly what was happening. His caution about the Primarchs had been based on the assumption that superhuman beings would be more susceptible to corruption than enhanced mortals. The reality proved exactly the opposite. "Lord Emperor," General Horus Lupercal transmitted from his position, commanding the remaining Loyalist expedition fleets, "the False Emperor's forces are converging on Terra. Corrupted Thunder Warriors, traitor Space Marines, and demon engines from Mars. They're building for a siege that will test everything we've built." The reports continued to flood in as the scale of the corruption became clear. Entire sectors had fallen to the False Emperor's influence, their populations convinced that the being they had served for decades was actually a tyrant, suppressing humanity's divine potential. Chaos cults that had operated in secret for generations suddenly emerged into the open, supported by corrupted imperial forces that gave them legitimacy and military power. "The War Master Sejanus approaches Terra with a fleet of 200 vessels," reported Admiral Marcus Valerius, the title carrying bitter irony given its source. His flagship, it's the Vengeful Spirit, somehow reconstructed from its destruction at Istvan. The ship broadcasts chaos emanations that our navigators cannot safely approach. The False Emperor's forces had taken the title and symbols of imperial authority and turned them into weapons against the imperium itself. Sejanus, transformed by chaos corruption into something that was no longer entirely human, commanded with all his original tactical genius, enhanced by supernatural insight that made him a match for any loyalist general. As reports of the approaching siege reached Terra, the Emperor finally admitted the truth that had been hidden behind layers of careful planning and strategic compromise. "I was wrong," he announced to the assembled defenders of Terra, his golden armor reflecting the light of a sun that might soon set on human civilization. "In my caution, I gave our enemies exactly what they needed to destroy us. The Primarchs were meant to be incorruptible, not because of their genetic enhancement, but because of their connection to me. In denying them that connection, I made them unable to resist the very forces I sought to protect them from." The realization came too late to prevent the catastrophe, but perhaps in time to limit its scope. The true Emperor, the chaos-corrupted vision of what the master of mankind might become if he embraced the power of the warp, was coming to Terra with forces that included some of the Empire's finest warriors. The siege that was about to begin would not be the familiar struggle between imperial forces and alien invaders. Instead, it would be brother against brother. The corrupted best of humanity turned against those who remained loyal to the Emperor's original vision. "Prepare Terra's defenses," the Emperor commanded, though his voice carried the weight of someone who understood that military preparations alone would not be sufficient for what was coming. "And send word to all loyal Primarchs, their father has need of them at last." The age of the scattered suns was ending in the worst possible way. Instead of reunion, there would be civil war. Instead of the family the Emperor had once envisioned, there would be brothers choosing sides in a conflict that would determine whether humanity would rise to claim its destiny among the stars or fall to the very powers that had shaped human history from the shadows. The heresy that was about to consume Terra bore little resemblance to what imperial planners had prepared for. This would not be superhuman sons rebelling against their father. Instead, it would be the father's greatest creations, corrupted by the very forces he had spent his existence fighting, turned into weapons against everything he had built. The great test was about to begin. Chapter 11. Thunder's Last Stand. The walls of the imperial palace had stood for 30,000 years, weathering the rise and fall of civilizations, the fury of old night, and the endless wars that had shaped Terra's blood-soaked history. Yet, as the corrupted fleet of the false emperor descended through Terra's atmosphere like a cloud of metallic locusts, those ancient fortifications faced their greatest test. Enemy numbers exceed all projections, reported Captain General Konstantin Voldor from the Eternity Wall spaceport, his enhanced Vox transmission carrying the sound of weapons fire that shook the very foundations of the palace. Corrupted Thunder warriors numbering in the hundreds of thousands, supported by demon engines from Mars and traitor space marine companies. The false emperor has turned our own strength against us. The assault had begun at dawn, Terra Standard Time, with orbital bombardments that lit the sky like a second sunrise. Yet unlike previous sieges in human history, this was not an external invasion, but a civil war between the finest warriors humanity had ever produced. Corrupted Thunder warriors, their genetic instabilities transformed by chaos into unnatural enhancements, crashed against defensive positions manned by custodian guard and loyal space marines in battles that transcended anything the galaxy had ever witnessed. From the highest tower of the inner sanctum, the Emperor of mankind watched his empire tear itself apart. His golden armor reflected the fires that consumed the city below, while his consciousness extended across multiple dimensions to coordinate defenses against enemies who knew imperial tactics, as well as any loyal defender. "The Primarchs have arrived," announced Malkador the Sigillite, his ancient form bearing new scars from the psychic warfare that accompanied every phase of the siege. Horus leads the air defense from the Sky orbital platform. Lionel Johnson commands the counterfleet operations. Vulcan has fortified the civilian evacuation zones. They fight for you, my lord, despite everything that has passed between you. The Emperor's golden eyes tracked the movement of superhuman figures across the battlefield below. His sons, those who had chosen loyalty over independence, moved through the carnage with capabilities that made even corrupted Thunder warriors seem merely mortal by comparison. Each Primarch represented the kind of leadership that the Great Crusade had always needed, now finally deployed in defense of the civilization they had been created to build. Yet the enemy they faced was unlike anything the Primarchs had encountered during their scattered upbringings across the galaxy. "The false Emperor's champions approach the palace gates," transmitted Primarch Ferrus Manus from his position commanding the Iron Hands at the Sanctum Imperialis. "These are not the Thunder warriors we remember from the Great Crusade. Chaos has enhanced them. Some stand 3 meters tall, their weapons crackling with warp energy that makes our armor scream in feedback loops." The corrupted Thunder warriors had been transformed by decades of exposure to chaos influence into something that resembled their original purpose while transcending every limitation that had once constrained them. Their genetic instabilities had been replaced by warp-fueled enhancements that made them faster, stronger, and more durable than any baseline human modification could achieve. More importantly, they fought with the tactical knowledge of veterans who had helped conquer terror itself. "Perimeter breached at Gate 7, reported Captain Nathaniel Garrow of the Death Guard, his Vox transmission crackling with interference from exotic weapons. "Corrupted Thunder warriors are advancing through the Palace Promenade. Request immediate reinforcement or authorization for tactical withdrawal." The response came not from the command structure, but from the thunder of boots on marble as Primarch Horus Lupercal led a countercharge that drove the invaders back through sheer force of superhuman capability. The Skyborn King of Chthoniya had proven his loyalty beyond question, his charismatic leadership inspiring even Custodian Guard to achievements that exceeded their already superhuman standards. Yet even as loyal forces held critical positions, the most significant confrontation of the siege was developing in the throne room of the inner palace itself. General Hasta Sejanus, the war master of the false emperor, strode through the shattered gates of the Sanctum Imperialis, with steps that left burning footprints in the marble floor. The figure that had once served as the emperor's most trusted mortal commander had been transformed by chaos corruption into something that bore only superficial resemblance to the man he had once been. His armor writhed with symbols that hurt to look upon directly, while his weapons crackled with energies drawn from dimensions that should not have existed. "Horus!" Sejanus called, his voice carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate with the screams of dying worlds. "Come forward and face the true War Master. Come and learn what loyalty to false gods costs those who serve them." The duel that followed would be recorded in imperial histories as the moment when the Great Crusade's greatest tactical minds clashed in personal combat. Horus, fighting with the superhuman capabilities that marked him as one of the Emperor's true sons, faced Sejanus, enhanced by chaos power that made him a match for any Primarch in single combat. "You were supposed to die on Istvan," Horus observed, as they circled each other through the ruins of what had once been the throne room's ceremonial gardens. "The virus bombs should have claimed you along with everyone else." "Death was the beginning, not the end," Sejanus replied, his corrupted features shifting between the face Horus remembered and something that belonged in nightmares. "The true powers showed me what your father has been hiding, the divine potential that he hoards for himself while denying it to those who serve him. I have become what he could have made all of us, if his cowardice had not blinded him to possibility." Their weapons met with impacts that shattered marble columns and sent shockwaves through the palace foundations. Horus fought with the disciplined fury of a warrior defending everything he believed in, while Sejanus attacked with the manic energy of someone who had gazed into the heart of chaos and found it beautiful. Meanwhile, in the skies above Terra, Lion L. Johnson led the most crucial engagement of the entire siege. "Traitor fleet is attempting orbital bombardment of the palace," the Lion transmitted from the bridge of his flagship, Invincible Reason. "Their vessels show corruption patterns that make targeting difficult. Reality seems to bend around them, initiating ramming assault on the command ship." The Lion's approach to void warfare was as direct and uncompromising as his approach to everything else. Unable to reliably target enemy vessels that flickered between dimensions, he ordered his fleet into close-range engagements that turned the space around Terra into a charnel house of burning metal and escaping atmosphere. Yet the most significant confrontation was occurring within the Emperor's own throne room, where the master of mankind faced an enemy that represented the ultimate corruption of his life's work. The figure that called itself the Last Thunder Warrior. Primarch stood nearly 4 meters tall, its massive frame clad in armor that seemed to be forged from crystallized violence itself. This was Arik Taranis, the original Thunder Warrior, who had led the conquest of Terra 30,000 years earlier, transformed by decades of chaos corruption into something that claimed to be the Emperor's true firstborn. "Father," Tyrannus spoke, the word carrying mockery that made reality itself seem to recoil in disgust. "Look upon your true son, the one who conquered worlds in your name before you decided that mortals were insufficient for your divine purpose. I have become what you always intended your Thunder Warriors to be, enhanced beyond the limitations of flesh and time." The Emperor drew his own sword, a blade that had been forged before the birth of human civilization and quenched in the deaths of gods. "You were my greatest creation, Arik, the prototype for everything that followed. But you chose corruption over evolution, chaos over order. You are no longer my son." Their battle transcended the merely physical, becoming a contest of philosophies made manifest through superhuman combat. The Emperor fought with techniques perfected across millennia of warfare against humanity's greatest enemies, while Tyrannus wielded powers granted by entities that had existed since the birth of the galaxy itself. Around them, the Imperial Palace burned as Thunder Warrior fought Custodian, corrupted Space Marine clashed with loyal Primarch, and the greatest civilization humanity had ever built tore itself apart through civil war that would reshape the galaxy's future. "The throne room is secured," Horus reported over the Battlefield Vox network, his transmission carrying exhaustion that came from more than physical combat. "Sejanus is dead. The false Emperor's command structure is collapsing." "Palace perimeter is holding," added Lion L. Johnson from orbit. "Traitor fleet is withdrawing after catastrophic losses. Victory is achievable." Yet even as loyalist forces gained the upper hand, the Emperor's duel with his corrupted firstborn reached its climax. Tyrannus had been enhanced by chaos power that made him nearly the equal of his creator, yet he lacked the wisdom and experience that came from 30,000 years of defending humanity against its enemies. "You could have been magnificent," the Emperor said, as his sword found its mark, piercing the heart that had once beaten with loyalty to human civilization. "You were the first and greatest of my warriors. Instead, you chose to become a monument to everything I sought to overcome." As Tyrannus collapsed, his massive frame dissolving into energies that screamed back into the warp, the last Thunder Warrior spoke his final words. "We were your children, too." The siege of Terra ended, not with triumph, but with exhaustion. Loyal forces had held the palace, but at costs that would echo across the galaxy for millennia to come. Much of Terra's greatest city lay in ruins, while the casualties among both Custodian Guard and Space Marines had been catastrophic. "Victory," reported Constantin Voldor, though his voice carried no celebration. "The false Emperor's forces are broken. The corruption has been purged from Imperial command structures. But the price..." The Emperor stood among the ruins of his throne room, surrounded by the bodies of warriors who had served him since the conquest of Terra itself. His golden armor was stained with blood, both loyal and corrupt, while his ancient features showed exhaustion that went beyond the merely physical. "The Thunder Warriors are ended," he announced to his surviving commanders. "Their age of service is complete. Now we must rebuild with what remains, and ensure that such corruption never takes root in Imperial structures again." Around him, the scattered Primarchs who had chosen loyalty over independence stood as living proof that his original vision had not been entirely flawed. They had proven themselves capable of the very leadership that the Great Crusade had always required, yet they had done so through choice rather than compulsion. The age of the Thunder Warriors was over. The age of the Primarchs, properly understood at last, was about to begin. Chapter 12. Empire of Ashes and Stars. 5 years had passed since the last Thunder Warrior fell in the ruins of the Imperial Palace, and Terra bore the scars of that victory like an old soldier displaying his wounds with grim pride. The great spires had been rebuilt, stronger than before, but somehow less magnificent, practical fortifications rather than symbols of divine authority. In the deepest chambers beneath the palace, machinery hummed with purpose that would have been incomprehensible to any mind, save that of the master of mankind himself. The golden throne rose from the bedrock of Terra like a technological mountain, its golden surfaces reflecting light that seemed to come from dimensions beyond the merely physical. The Emperor stood before its control matrices, his form diminished by the wounds he had sustained during his final duel with the last Thunder Warrior Primarch, yet somehow more focused for the limitations imposed upon his divine frame. "The psychic amplification systems are nearing completion," reported Malcador the Sigillite, his ancient form bent with exhaustion that went beyond the merely physical. "The throne will allow you to guide the Astronomicon while simultaneously coordinating psycho networks across the galaxy. Yet the cost is acceptable," the Emperor replied, his golden eyes studying readouts that showed the slow transformation of Terra's defensive networks. "I have learned that my direct involvement in every aspect of galactic governance was inefficient. The throne will allow me to provide the guidance that only I can give while delegating operational authority to those capable of wielding it effectively." Around them, the new order of the Imperium was taking shape in ways that would have been unimaginable before the Thunder Warrior Rebellion had tested every assumption about human governance and military organization. The scattered Primarchs, who had proven their loyalty through fire and blood, now served not as subordinate generals, but as regional governors, each one ruling domains that spanned dozens of star systems according to their individual philosophies and capabilities. "The Council of Suns convenes today," announced Primarch Horus Lupercal, approaching through corridors that had been rebuilt to accommodate superhuman physiques. The Skyborn King of Chthoniya bore new scars from the siege of Terra, yet his presence radiated the confidence of someone who had found his true purpose at last. Guilliman requests authorization for expansion into the Ghoul stars. Lion L. Johnson reports successful compliance of the Rangdan systems. The Great Crusade continues, though not as we once envisioned it. The transformation of imperial structure had been driven by necessity rather than ideology. With the mortal command hierarchy devastated by chaos corruption, and the surviving Primarchs proven capable of independent strategic thinking, the Emperor had been forced to acknowledge that his original vision of centralized control was both impractical and potentially dangerous. "Robut has expanded the Ultramar domain to encompass 200 worlds," the Emperor observed, consulting reports that painted a picture of imperial growth unlike anything previously achieved. His administrative genius has created a model of governance that other Primarchs are adapting to their own territories. We are becoming less an empire than a federation of superhuman-led domains. It was a development that would have troubled him greatly in earlier years, when the dream of unified human civilization had driven every strategic decision. Yet the Thunder Warrior Rebellion had demonstrated the dangers of concentrating too much power in any single command structure, whether mortal or superhuman. "The Iron Hands have established 17 recruitment worlds in the Medusa sector," Horus continued, reading from data slates that documented the emergence of new Space Marine legions. "Ferrus Manus has developed gene seed cultivation techniques that allow independent legion expansion without relying on Terra's facilities. Each Primarch now commands forces that rival the Great Crusade's original expedition fleets. The creation of independent Space Marine legions had been one of the most significant changes in imperial military doctrine. Rather than the centralized recruitment and training that had characterized the early Terran-born Space Marines, each loyal Primarch now cultivated his own legion, using gene seed technology captured from the corrupted forces during the Siege of Terra. The Death Guard recruits from worlds touched by toxins and radiation, reported Captain Nathaniel Garrow, whose scarred features bore witness to the siege's aftermath. Mortarion has developed enhancement techniques that allow his legion to operate in environments that would kill even other Space Marines. His domain includes 12 worlds that were previously considered uninhabitable. These independent legions represented a fundamental shift in imperial military philosophy. Where the original plan had called for standardized forces operating under unified command, the new legions were specialized for their Primarchs' particular approaches to warfare and governance. The result was military capabilities that far exceeded what centralized planning had achieved, yet came with risks that kept imperial strategists awake during the quiet hours. "Some brothers remain beyond our reach," Lionel Johnson announced, as he joined the gathering, his pale eyes reflecting concern that went beyond mere tactical considerations. Alpharius and Omegon have vanished entirely. Their Alpha Legion operates throughout Imperial space, but their ultimate loyalties remain unknown. Two others, Primarchs of the 2nd and 11th Legions, have simply disappeared along with entire star systems. Our long-range scouts find only empty space where their domains should exist. The missing Primarchs represented one of the most troubling aspects of the new Imperial Order. Unlike the Thunder Warrior rebellion, which had been driven by chaos corruption that could be identified and fought, the disappearances suggested threats that operated beyond Imperial understanding. Entire sectors that had been brought into compliance during the Great Crusade now showed no signs of human habitation, as if they had been erased from reality itself. The warp storms grow stronger each year, Magnus the Red transmitted from distant Prospero, his psychic voice carrying across the void with information that defied conventional communication. I sense powers moving in the Imperium that make the entities behind the Thunder Warrior rebellion seem like mere nuisances. The galaxy faces threats that will test everything we have built. Yet despite these ominous developments, the Great Crusade continued its expansion into territories that had never known human rule. The pace had slowed dramatically from the early years of rapid compliance campaigns, but the victories achieved were more durable, built upon foundations of understanding and cooperation rather than simple military conquest. The Fenris sector reports 17 worlds brought into compliance through negotiation rather than conquest, reported Lehman Russ via long-range transmission. The Wolf King has developed diplomatic protocols that appeal to warrior cultures across multiple star systems. His methods are unconventional, but effective. Each Primarch had developed approaches to expansion that reflected their individual philosophies and the lessons learned from their scattered upbringings. Vulcan emphasized the protection of civilian populations and the preservation of local cultures. Fulgrim pursued perfection in both military conquest and post-compliance development. Corax specialized in liberating worlds from oppressive regimes through precision strikes and popular uprising. The Council of Suns has become the most effective governing body the Imperium has ever possessed, observed Constantine Valdor, his golden armor bearing new honorific markings that commemorated his service during the siege. Each Primarch brings capabilities that exceed anything mortal administrators could achieve, yet their independence makes them unpredictable. It was the fundamental tension that defined the new Imperial Order. The scattered Primarchs had proven themselves capable of exactly the kind of leadership that the Great Crusade had always required, yet their individual approaches to governance and warfare sometimes conflicted with unified imperial policy. The result was an empire that grew in multiple directions simultaneously, adapting to local conditions with flexibility that centralized planning could never have achieved. We are becoming something different than what I originally envisioned, the Emperor admitted as he stood before the great tactical display that showed the current extent of human civilization. Not the unified empire I dreamed of, but perhaps something more resilient. A federation of human domains, each adapted to its local environment, yet bound together by common purpose. The display showed an imperium that spanned nearly 1,000,000 worlds, yet one that bore little resemblance to the centralized empire that early imperial planners had designed. Instead of uniform administrative structures and standardized military forces, the galaxy now contained dozens of distinct domains, each one reflecting its Primarchs' individual approach to governance and warfare. The question, Malcador observed quietly, is whether this diversity will prove to be strength or weakness when we face threats that require unified response. The Emperor was silent for a long moment, his consciousness extending beyond the confines of flesh to touch the distant stars where his sons ruled in his name. Through the psychic networks that connected imperial worlds, he could sense the pulse of human civilization as it adapted to challenges that no single mind could have anticipated. "I chose caution over ambition," he said finally, his golden eyes reflecting calculations that spanned strategic, tactical, and philosophical considerations across multiple timelines. "I sought to protect my children from corruption by denying them their intended purpose. The result was corruption, spreading through the very foundations I thought were secure." The irony was not lost on any of them. The Emperor's decision to abandon the Primarch project had been driven by the desire to prevent chaos corruption, yet chaos had simply found different vectors for its influence. The scattered Primarchs, growing to maturity without their father's guidance, had developed exactly the independence and moral certainty that made them resistant to the corruption that had consumed their mortal counterparts. "Perhaps," suggested Horus carefully, "caution and ambition need not be mutually exclusive. We have learned that strength comes not from uniformity, but from diversity, guided by common purpose. The Imperium may be more federal than imperial, but it has proven capable of surviving challenges that would have destroyed a more centralized structure." As the golden light of Terra's sun set through the crystal windows of the rebuilt palace, the Emperor allowed himself a moment of contemplation about the choices that had led to this moment. His sons ruled domains that exceeded his original dreams in scope and achievement, yet they did so as independent lords rather than obedient generals. The Great Crusade continued, but as a cooperative venture between sovereign powers rather than a unified military campaign. "The galaxy remains dangerous," he observed, watching as the stars emerged in the darkening sky. "Xenos empires that view human expansion with hostility. Ancient intelligences that see our civilization as a threat to cosmic order. And always, the chaos powers that seek to corrupt everything we build. Yet humanity survives, adapts and grows stronger through diversity." The view from the palace windows showed a galaxy where human civilization had taken root in forms that no single architect could have designed. Some worlds had become fortress monasteries, where space marines trained for eternal war. Others had transformed into garden paradises, where human culture flourished under enlightened rule. Still others served as industrial powerhouses that fed the imperial war machine while protecting their populations from exploitation. It was not the unified human empire that the Emperor had originally envisioned, but perhaps it was something better, a civilization capable of adapting to any threat, because it contained multitudes rather than uniformity. "The work continues," the Emperor announced to his assembled commanders and advisors. "Not as I planned, but as the galaxy demands. My sons have proven themselves worthy of the independence they claimed through trial by fire. Now we must ensure that their achievements endure across the millennia to come." As the palace settled into the quiet hours of the Terran night cycle, the Emperor took his place before the Golden Throne, ready to begin the long vigil that would guide human civilization across the dark pathways between stars. Around him, the greatest empire in galactic history continued its growth through the vision and leadership of sons who had found their own paths to greatness. The age of the scattered suns was ending. The age of the Council of Suns had begun. Whether it would prove sufficient for the challenges ahead remained to be seen. But for the first time since the project's abandonment decades earlier, the Emperor allowed himself to believe that his children might indeed be capable of achieving everything he had once dreamed possible. And perhaps even more.